Welcome, friend. Find yourself a comfortable position, let your shoulders drop, and allow your breathing to settle into its own natural rhythm. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey into the American West of the Ichenbabits, not the romanticized version of campfires and cattle drives you might imagine, but the quieter, colder reality of how ordinary people endured the bitter winters that swept across the plains and mountains. The Old West was a landscape of extremes. Summer heat could blister the earth until it cracked. But winter was something else entirely. Imagine yourself in a time before central heating, before insulated walls, before the simple twist of a thermostat could summon warmth from thin air. Picture instead a world where survival through a January night required planning, ingenuity, and an intimate understanding of cold itself. We'll walk together through these frozen months, exploring how people, settlers, indigenous communities, miners, ranchers, soldiers, created warmth where none existed, how they transformed simple materials into barriers against temperatures that could kill, and how the rhythm of their days revolved around the constant, exhausting task of staying alive when winter settled over the land like a heavy blanket of ice. And let yourself drift as we explore this world. There's no urgency here, no need to remember every detail. Simply allow the images to form in your mind, the sensory experiences of another time washing over you like gentle waves. You're safe, warm, comfortable, everything those frontier people worked so desperately to achieve. Let us begin. Imagine yourself waking in a homestead cabin somewhere on the Dakota Plains. Perhaps in the winter of Ichenbabichisherba, darkness still presses against the single window, though whether it's 4 in the morning or 6, you cannot easily tell. Winter mornings arrive late and reluctant in these northern latitudes. The first sensation you register, even before full consciousness returns, is the cold. The temperature inside the cabin hovers somewhere just above freezing. Breath emerges in visible clouds, each exhalation a small ghost that rises toward the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. Before dissipating, the warmth you carried through the night, cocooned beneath layers of quilts, buffalo robes, and whatever blankets the family could gather, has created a small pocket of survivable air. But beyond the edge of your bedding, the room waits with its sharp, patient chill. You don't leap from bed here. Movement must be calculated, deliberate. The wooden floor bare planks with gaps you can see through and dot places radiates cold that would shock bare feet into painful awareness. Instead, you remain still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house. The wind, which has been your constant companion since November, presses against the exterior walls with a low, persistent moan. Somewhere, a loose board creaks rhythmically, expanding and contracting in the cold. If you're fortunate, you might hear the faint crackling of embers still alive in the stove from last night's final stoking. The stove, a cast iron box sitting at the cabin center, or perhaps against one wall, represents the absolute heart of winter survival. Your father, or perhaps you yourself if you're the head of this household, had risen at least twice during the night to feed it. This is the rhythm of winter sleep in the West, not 8 uninterrupted hours, but a cycle of brief, warming wakefulness followed by gradual descent back into cold and sleep, then waking again when the chill becomes impossible to ignore. Now the true work begins. Someone must rise first, must break the warm seal of bedding, and brave the cold to resurrect the fire. In many households, this duty rotates, though often it falls to whoever seems most capable of the swift movements required. The procedure has been refined through necessity into something like a ritual. Clothes were laid out the night before, within arm's reach of the bed. Not today's clothes necessarily. Those might freeze stiff if left out. But yesterday's clothes, still carrying some residual warmth from your body. You dress beneath the covers as much as possible, working wool socks over feet that already ache with cold, pulling on long underwear, trousers, and a shirt while still horizontal, postponing the moment of full exposure. When you finally emerge and move toward the stove, your first task is assessment. You kneel beside it, the metal already beginning to lose, what little heat remains from the night. Opening the stove door reveals a landscape of ash and, if fortune has smiled, a few sullen orange embers buried deep. These embers are precious. They represent the difference between rekindling the fire in minutes versus the laborious process of starting from scratch with flint and steel, or worse, walking to a neighbor's cabin to borrow fire. You've prepared kindling the night before, of course. Thin strips of pine, dry grass stuffed into every crack and corner, perhaps some fat wood if you've managed to find the resinous heartwood of a dead pine. These materials wait in a box beside the stove, protected from any moisture. You arrange them carefully over the embers, creating pathways for air to flow, for heat to climb. Then, larger pieces, split cottonwood or whatever timber you've managed to gather and season, each piece placed with consideration for how it will catch and burn. The moment when the kindling catches, when a small tentative flame appears, brings a relief that never quite becomes routine, no matter how many winters you've survived. You remain kneeling there, feeding the young fire with increasing care, watching it grow from a fragile flicker into something more substantial, more reliable. As the fire establishes itself and the stove begins its work of heating the iron that will, in turn, heat the air, you can feel the cabin beginning its slow transformation. The process is gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The quality of the cold changes. It becomes less aggressive, less penetrating. The frost that has formed on the inside of the window, elaborate crystals built up overnight, begins to weep, small droplets running down to pool on the sill. By now, others in the household are stirring. Children emerge from the loft where they sleep together. Their combined body heat a necessary survival strategy. A wife or sister begins preparing breakfast, working with ingredients that have been carefully managed through the winter. Months. Everything is a calculation. Stores of flour, salt pork, dried beans, perhaps some cornmeal. In a good year, with adequate preparation, there might be preserves, dried fruit, root vegetables stored in a cellar or buried in sand to prevent freezing. Water presents its own challenge. If there's a well nearby, it might still be accessible, though the rope might be stiff with ice, the bucket requiring several attempts to lower and raise. More likely, especially in deep winter, you're melting snow. Pans of snow sit on the stove, and you watch them with a mix of fascination and impatience, so much volume reducing to so little water, a reminder of the deceptive nature of snow's bulk. The morning meal is hot, this is essential. Porridge, perhaps thick with whatever grain you have, coffee if you're fortunate, though the supplies brought from the nearest town a day's ride or more distant must be carefully rationed. The heat of the food does more than nourish. It provides internal warmth, a foundation of calories that your body will burn through the day to maintain its temperature. After breakfast, the day's work divides along practiced lines. If there are animals, horses, oxen, perhaps a milk cow, chickens, if they've survived the winter, they require attention. The barn, if you have one, provides some shelter, but it's still far from warm. Animals in winter are fragile creatures. Their survival dependent on adequate fodder and water that hasn't frozen solid. You might find yourself breaking ice from water troughs with an axe, hauling hay from stores that seem to diminish with frightening speed, checking for signs of illness or injury that cold weather exacerbates. For those without animals, or once the animals have been tended, winter work often means maintenance and preparation. Tools need mending, harnesses require repair, ammunition needs accounting. Women's work continues regardless of season. There is always mending, always washing when water can be spared and heated, always food to prepare from limited ingredients. Children, if old enough, have their tasks, hauling wood from the woodpile to the box beside the stove, helping with younger siblings, learning the countless small skills that winter survival demands. The woodpile itself is a constant preoccupation, a measure of security as tangible as money in the bank. Throughout the autumn, every spare moment went to gathering, cutting, splitting, and stacking wood. The pile should be enormous. You need several cords to make it through a plains winter, more if the winter proves especially harsh or long. Each day you watch the pile diminish, and even when it seems adequate, There's an anxiety that accompanies its use, a mental arithmetic of wood remaining versus days of cold still to endure. Venturing outside for any reason means preparing as thoroughly as for a journey. Layers upon layers, long underwear, wool shirts, vests, coats, scarves wrapped around faces, hats pulled low, gloves or mittens, preferably mittens, which keep fingers together for warmth. Even so, exposure time must be limited. Frostbite is a genuine danger, and you've perhaps seen its consequences: blackened fingers or toes, extremities lost to the cold's hungry bite. The landscape outside is simultaneously beautiful and hostile. Snow covers everything in undulating drifts, sculpted by wind into shapes that seem almost architectural. The sky might be brilliantly clear, a blue so deep it seems almost painful to behold, or it might be heavy with gray clouds promising more snow. The wind, when it blows, is the true enemy. It strips away any warmth that clothing provides, finds every gap and seam, turns moderate cold into dangerous cold. Sound behaves strangely in winter cold. Distances become deceptive. A neighbor's axe might ring out with crystalline clarity from half a mile away, or the crack of ice on a distant stream might sound sharp and immediate. Your own footsteps in snow make different sounds depending on temperature. The squeak of very cold snow, the crunch of slightly warmer snow, the silence of fresh powder. Midday brings a subtle warmth, relatively speaking. The sun, even low in the winter sky, provides some radiant heat. If the day is calm and clear, you might feel its touch on your face, a reminder that warmth still exists in the universe. This is the time for any outdoor work that absolutely must be done: repairs to fencing that the cold makes brittle, checking on stores and outdoor sheds, perhaps hunting if game is available and you're capable. Hunting in winter is a desperate, often futile endeavor. Animals are scarce, having migrated or gone to ground. Those that remain are thin, their meat providing less sustenance than you might hope. But fresh meat, when it can be obtained, is a prize beyond measure. It means protein, fat, a break from the monotony of preserved foods. The afternoon brings a gradual return to the cabin's interior. Light begins to fail surprisingly early, the short winter days offering perhaps 8 hours of useful daylight, sometimes less. The temperature, which might have risen into the teens or 20s Fahrenheit during the sun's brief peak, begins its plummet toward nighttime lows that might reach 20 or 30 below zero. Sometimes colder. Evening tasks begin: preparing the night's meal, securing the animals one final time, bringing in enough wood to see through the night's multiple stoking sessions. The stove continues its work, demanding fuel, radiating heat that barely reaches the cabin's corners. In those far corners, ice might remain on the walls throughout the winter, frost that never quite melts, a reminder of the cold's patient persistence. Supper is again hot, again substantial. You eat more in winter than in summer, your body requiring the fuel. The meal might be beans and salt pork, or stew made from whatever ingredients remain, thickened with flour, seasoned with precious salt. Bread, if there's enough flour and if someone has the energy to bake, though the oven's heat makes the cabin almost too warm, a problem that will reverse within hours. After supper, there is little to do but endure. Reading, if anyone is literate and if there are books or newspapers, though these are rare luxuries. Conversation, stories told and retold. Handwork by whatever light the fire provides. Mending, knitting, carving. Children might play quiet games, their usual energy dampened by the cold in the cabin's confines. The psychological weight of winter is perhaps as challenging as the physical cold. You are trapped, constrained to this small space with the same people, doing the same things, day after day after day. The monotony becomes oppressive. Small annoyances magnify into serious grievances. Tempers fray. The walls seem to press inward. Yet there are moments of unexpected beauty, small graces that pierce the difficulty, the way firelight plays across the cabin's interior, creating shadows that dance and shift, the sound of wind outside making the inside seem, by contrast, a haven, the warmth of bodies pressed together, family or fellow settlers, the simple mammalian comfort of shared heat. And as bedtime approaches, preparations mirror the mornings in reverse. The stove is loaded heavily with the largest logs available, packed tight in hope they'll burn slowly through the night. Beds are prepared, layers of blankets and quilts arranged in the order that experience has proven most effective. Heavy quilts on bottom, lighter blankets in middle layers. Another heavy quilt on top to trap heat. If there are bricks or stones, they've been heated by the stove and wrapped in cloth to place at the foot of the bed. Small radiators that will keep feet warm for a few precious hours. You burrow into bed wearing most of your clothes. Only the outermost layers are removed. Children pile together 2 or 3 to a bed, their combined warmth a survival necessity. Married couples sleep pressed close, and there's no particular romance to this proximity. It's simple thermodynamics. 2 bodies heating a smaller space more efficiently than one. Sleep, when it comes, is neither deep nor uninterrupted. You wake when the cold begins to penetrate your cocoon of blankets, when you realize the fire has died down too far. Someone must rise, add wood, stir the embers back to life. This might happen twice, 3 times, 4 times in a night. It's exhausting, this broken sleep, but it's the pattern that keeps you alive. And through it all, through the cold and the work and the monotony and the constant calculation of resources, there is a strange grim satisfaction. Each morning that you wake is a victory. Each day that the family remains healthy, that the food holds out, that the wood lasts, is a success. You are surviving in a landscape that does not care whether you live or die, against cold that would kill you in hours if you lost the battle against it. This is the daily life of winter in the Old West. Not an adventure, not a series of exciting events, but a grinding, relentless maintenance of the bare necessities of existence. The rhythm of your days is dictated entirely by cold, and the fight against it. Everything else, ambitions, plans, dreams, must wait for spring. Must wait for spring. Let these images settle in your mind now. The cabin with its single room, the stove radiating its inadequate warmth, the frost on the inside of windows, the endless cycle of wood and fire and cold. You are warm now. In your modern bed, in your climate-controlled room. The cold of the past cannot reach you here. Let that security wrap around you like a blanket. Now, let yourself drift deeper into the past, to a particular winter that became legendary across the northern plains and mountain territories. The winter of Ichen Batbata Lubtu Batbata Shuti, a season that would later be known simply as the Great Die-Up or the Big Die among cattlemen, a winter so severe it fundamentally transformed the ranching industry and shattered fortunes that had seemed unassailable. And to understand this winter, we must first understand the world that preceded it, the particular alchemy of ambition and opportunity that had created the open-range cattle industry of the American West. Picture the landscape of the northern plains in the early Ichenbat Badgers, Montana Territory, Wyoming Territory, the western Dakotas. Vast grasslands stretched to horizons that seemed impossibly distant. Grass that grew thick and nutritious. Land that appeared limitless. After the decimation of the great buffalo herds and the forced relocation of indigenous peoples to reservations, this land stood seemingly empty, waiting to be claimed not through formal ownership. Much of it was public domain, but through use. Cake. The cattle boom had arrived with a rush of enthusiasm that bordered on fever. Eastern investors, British aristocrats, experienced ranchers from Texas, ambitious young men seeking their fortunes, all poured into the northern territories with their herds. The logic seemed unassailable. Cattle could be bought cheaply in Texas, driven north to the open range, and allowed to graze freely on public grasslands through the summer, then rounded up and shipped east to market for substantial profits. The grass was free, the land was open, and the markets seemed insatiable. Kanked. Among these cattlemen was a young man named Granville Stewart. Though by Ichenbat Bashalv he was no longer particularly young, he had come to Montana in the Ichenbabite Worsers during the gold rush, had prospected, traded, ranched, and now managed the DHS outfit, one of the largest operations in Montana Territory. Stewart was a careful observer, a man who kept detailed journals, and his accounts of this period provide an intimate window into the disaster that approached. So, The summer of Ichinbaba-Basharloop had been difficult. Drought had stunted the grass, leaving the ranges drier than usual. The spring roundup had revealed something troubling. The ranges were overstocked. Too many cattle from too many outfits competed for forage. Theodore Roosevelt, ranching in the Dakota Badlands, noted the same concern. The newcomers, the pilgrims, as established ranchers called them, had brought in herds without understanding the carrying capacity of the land, without respecting the delicate balance required. But summer's difficulties seemed manageable. The real character of the northern plains revealed itself in winter. And most winters, while cold, had been survivable. Cattle were remarkably hardy creatures. Texas longhorns, which made up much of the herds, could withstand harsh conditions. They would paw through snow to reach the grass beneath, would seek shelter in gullies and creek bottoms, would survive on. The previous winters had proven this, had made ranchers confident, perhaps overconfident. The autumn of Ichinbaba-Basharloop brought warnings that some heeded and others ignored. Old-timers, indigenous people who had lived on these lands for generations, noted troubling signs. The muskrats built their lodges higher than usual. The bark on the north side of trees seemed thicker. Birds migrated earlier and in greater numbers. The coats of horses and wild animals grew unusually thick and long. Sturt, ever cautious, tried to prepare. He brought some of his cattle closer to the ranch headquarters, secured additional hay, though nothing like what would ultimately be needed. But hay cost money, and the economics of open-range ranching depended on not feeding cattle, on letting them forage for themselves. To buy hay for thousands of cattle was to undermine the entire business model. November arrived with cold that seemed normal at first, but possessed a quality, a sharpness, a persistence, that suggested something different. The first significant snow fell in mid-November, not unusual in itself, but it fell heavy and wet, coating everything in a thick layer that then froze solid as temperatures plummeted. Nick, cowboys on the range noted that the cattle seemed uneasy. Normally, when snow fell, the animals would paw through it to the grass beneath. But this snow, frozen into a hard crust, resisted their efforts. They would paw, find no easy access to forage, and move on, searching for easier grazing. The energy they expended in this searching began to exceed the nutrition they obtained. December brought more snow, layer upon layer. Between storms, brutal cold descended, temperatures dropping to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. At those temperatures, exposed flesh freezes in minutes. Breath crystallizes instantly. The cold penetrates everything, finds every weakness. Imagine yourself as a cowboy in one of the line camps. Small, crude cabins stationed at the edges of the range where riders stay to monitor the herds. Perhaps you're 20 miles from the nearest ranch headquarters, sharing a one-room shack with 2 other men. You've got a stove, some provisions, a few cords of wood you gathered in the fall. Your job is to ride the range, check on the cattle, turn back any that drift too far. But in this cold, riding becomes nearly impossible. Your horse struggles through snow that reaches its belly in places. The wind drives into your face with a force that makes breathing difficult. You've wrapped your face in scarves until only your eyes show. But even those eyes water from the cold, the tears freezing on your eyelashes. Your fingers, even in heavy gloves, lose feeling. Your feet become wooden blocks. Your feet become wooden blocks in your boots, and you find the cattle drifting south, pushed by the wind, seeking some shelter that doesn't exist on these open plains. They should scatter, spread out to find forage, but instead they bunch together. They bunch together, their instinct for the collective warmth of the herd overriding their need to feed. You try to turn them back, but they resist, their survival instinct telling them to flee the storm, even though there's nowhere to flee to. Back at the line camp, you and your partners hunker down. Now, the cabin is small enough that the stove can almost keep it warm, though frost still forms in the corners, and your breath still shows in the air, unless you're standing directly beside the iron stove. You take turns going out to bring in more wood, to check on your horses in the rough shed you've built. Each trip outside is an ordeal, a brief journey into a world that feels actively hostile to human life. And you're young men, most of you strong and resilient, yet you can feel the cold working on you, sapping strength, making every action require more effort. You eat constantly, burning through your provisions faster than planned, but your bodies demand the fuel. Sleep is difficult despite the exhaustion. The cold penetrates your blankets, the wind roars against the cabin walls, and there's an underlying anxiety that prevents true rest. The cattle, meanwhile, face conditions you can only imagine. They have no cabin, no stove, no ability to prepare. They stand in the open as the wind strips heat from their bodies. Ice forms on their faces, around their nostrils, on their eyelashes. They crowd together, the ones in the center slightly warmer, those on the edges bearing the brunt of the wind. They grow weaker each day, burning through the fat reserves they built up during summer, their bodies cannibalizing muscle for fuel. After each storm, there's a brief respite. The wind dies, the sky clears to that achingly beautiful winter blue. The temperature, if anything, drops even further on these clear nights. The cold is so intense it makes strange sounds. Trees crack and pop as their sap freezes and expands. The snow itself seems to creak and groan, settling and compacting. And cowboys venture out during these clear periods to assess the damage. What they find becomes increasingly grim. Cattle dead in groups, frozen where they huddled. Others alive but barely, too weak to rise, their eyes dull and unresponsive. Some have drifted miles from their home range, following creek bottoms or seeking the lee side of any small rise that might offer shelter from the wind. At the larger ranch houses, where owners or managers reside with their families, the winter takes on a different character but carries its own difficulties. These are more substantial buildings, perhaps 2 rooms instead of 1, better constructed with more provisions laid in. But they too are islands of marginal warmth in an ocean of cold. Sturt, at the DHS headquarters, watches the thermometer drop to levels he's never seen. 40 below, then 45. The mercury in the thermometer contracts so far down the tube it becomes difficult to read. 50 below. Temperatures where human survival outside becomes a matter of minutes, where exposed skin freezes almost instantly, where breathing the air feels dangerous, as if the cold itself might freeze your lungs from the inside. Kang. His wife and children huddle close to their stove. They've moved beds into the main room, abandoning the bedrooms which are too cold to sleep in. The water bucket kept inside the house develops a skin of ice overnight despite the fire. Condensation freezes on the windows in patterns of such elaborate beauty they seem like nature's mockery, crystalline artwork created by the very cold that threatens to kill them. The ranch hands who can make it back to headquarters bring reports. The cattle are dying in numbers that seem impossible. Not just the weak or the old, but prime steers, cows in their productive years, young animals that should have been hardy. The winter is indiscriminate in its harvest. January arrives, and with it more snow. This is not the light, fluffy snow of Colorado mountains or the wet, heavy snow of Pacific coastal storms. This is fine, crystalline snow that the wind picks up and drives horizontally across the plains, creating whiteout conditions that disorient and confuse. Visibility drops to a few feet. The boundary between sky and ground disappears into uniform white. Men have frozen to death yards from their cabins, unable to find their way in these conditions. The cattle by now are in desperate condition. Months of inadequate nutrition have left them skeletal. Their hip bones protrude sharply beneath their hides. Their ribs show clearly. They stand humped against the cold, their heads lowered, utterly spent. When they fall, they often don't rise again. They lie in the snow and the cold creeps in and they simply stop. There are stories, whether true or embellished by later telling, of cattle drifting before the wind until they reach fences or obstacles. There, unable to go further, they pile up, the living pressing against the dead, creating grotesque heaps of frozen flesh. Cowboys report coming across these accumulations, 20, 30, 50 cattle, in a tangled mass, frozen together in their final moments. Theodore Roosevelt, at his Elkhorn Ranch in Dakota, faces the same crisis. He's invested a substantial portion of his inheritance in his cattle operation, drawn to the west partly for his health, partly for the adventure, partly for the profit he was assured would come. Now trapped by storms, he can only wait and hope. He reads, writes letters, tends the fire, and tries not to calculate the financial disaster unfolding on the range. How February brings no relief. The snow continues, though perhaps less frequently. But the damage is done. The cattle that have survived this long are barely alive, their systems so compromised that recovery seems impossible even if the weather improves. They stand or lie in the snow, too weak to seek food, too depleted to generate body heat, waiting for the cold to finish its work. In the line camps and isolated cabins, provisions run dangerously low. The flour gets weaker, more bran than flour as it's used up. The coffee gives out, then the sugar, then the salt. Men find themselves eating beans boiled in unsalted water. Day after day, the monotony almost as oppressive as the cold. Camps run low on wood. The men venture out in the brutal cold to gather more, breaking frozen branches from trees, hauling deadfall from creek bottoms, burning anything that will combust. And there are instances of cowboys losing their way between barn and house, succumbing to the cold mere yards from safety. Others suffer severe frostbite, losing fingers, toes, parts of their noses or ears to the cold's hungry consumption. Some operations lose men entirely. A cowboy sent to check on a distant camp, who never returns, his body not found until the spring thaw reveals where he fell. King. March arrives, and finally, gradually, the character of the cold begins to shift. The temperatures rise from deadly to merely severe. The storms become less frequent. There are even days when the sun shows warmth, when you can feel its rays on your face and believe, however tentatively, that winter might end, but the damage has been done. As the snow begins to melt, as cowboys can finally ride the range again to assess the losses, the scale of the disaster becomes apparent. Dead cattle are everywhere, in coulees, along creek banks, in hollows and on hillsides. The frozen corpses lie scattered like a battlefield after some great slaughter. Stoddart rides out in early spring to make his count. Where there should be thousands of cattle, he finds hundreds. The DHS outfit has lost perhaps 60% of its herd, possibly more. The exact count proves impossible, as some cattle have drifted so far they'll never be found. Other ranchers report losses of 70, 80, even 90%. Years of investment, herds built up through careful breeding and management, wiped out in a single season. The financial calculations are brutal and swift. Men who considered themselves wealthy in the fall find themselves bankrupt by spring. British syndicates that had poured money into Western cattle discover their investments have simply vanished, consumed by the cold. The open-range cattle industry, which had seemed such a reliable path to wealth, reveals itself as catastrophically vulnerable. Theodore Roosevelt, assessing his losses, realizes he's lost the bulk of his herd. The financial blow is severe, though he has other resources to fall back on. But the experience shapes him, teaches him hard lessons about the risks of Western enterprises, about the power of nature to overwhelm human ambition. For the cowboys, the line riders, the ranch hands, the winter leaves different scars. These are men accustomed to hardship, but this winter has pushed them to limits they didn't know existed. Some leave the cattle business entirely, unable to face another winter on the range. Others stay, but they're changed, more cautious, more respectful of the forces they cannot control. The industry itself transforms. The era of open-range ranching effectively ends with this winter. Ranchers begin to fence their lands, to grow hay, to prepare for winter in ways they had previously considered unnecessary or too expensive. The romantic vision of cattle roaming free across endless grasslands gives way to a more managed, more controlled approach. The winter of Ichenbabibashlut-Fubashirti becomes a dividing line, a marker between the Old West and something newer, more practical. Those who lived through it speak of it for the rest of their lives, measuring all subsequent winters against that brutal standard. It was cold, they might say, of some later winter, but not like the Big Die. And in the spring and summer that follow, as grass grows up through the remains of the dead cattle, As coyotes and wolves and scavengers do their work, as nature gradually reclaims and processes the carnage, there is a quiet settling, a sense of lessons learned at terrible cost. Okay, let this story rest in your mind now. The cattle frozen in the snow, the cowboys huddled in their line camps, the slow realization of disaster. As spring revealed the winter's toll, you are far from that cold now, far from those desperate days. The warmth surrounds you, safe and secure. Let the images fade like snow melting in spring sun. Allow your mind to drift now into a different territory, a space where questions outnumber answers, where archaeological evidence whispers of practices and knowledge that have largely faded from living memory. We turn our attention to the methods, some proven, some mysterious, some perhaps exaggerated by time, by which people survived winters in the West before the settler wave, and how that ancient knowledge transferred incompletely to the newcomers. And the paradox that archaeologists and historians confront is this: indigenous peoples had lived through countless winters on the plains and in the mountains for thousands of years before European settlement. They not only survived but maintained complex societies, cultures, and traditions through seasonal cycles that included winters as brutal as any the settlers faced. Yet when Eurosettlers arrived, they often struggled desperately with conditions that indigenous communities had long since learned to navigate. Consider the evidence that archaeologists have uncovered from winter encampment sites across the West. In sheltered valleys in Montana, in canyon alcoves in Wyoming, in creek bottoms throughout the Dakotas, excavations reveal the remains of structures and practices that speak to sophisticated understanding of cold weather survival. The tipi, that iconic dwelling of the plains peoples, was not the simple tent that settlers sometimes imagined, but rather a precisely engineered shelter developed and refined over centuries. Archaeological remains, stone rings that once held down tipi covers, pea covers, patterns of post holes, fire pits with particular characteristics, tell us much but not everything. What the physical evidence shows, winter tipis were typically smaller than summer lodges, creating a more compact space that body heat and fire could warm more efficiently. The covers were often double-layered during winter months, creating an insulating air gap. The lower portion might be banked with earth or snow, utilizing snow's insulating properties. The smoke flaps at the top could be adjusted to control draft and heat loss while still allowing smoke to escape. But what the archaeological record cannot fully capture is the experiential knowledge, the subtle techniques passed down through generations, the exact angle at which to set the poles for maximum stability against winter winds, the precise way to arrange the fire to produce maximum heat with minimum smoke, the methods for maintaining comfort inside these structures when temperatures outside dropped far below zero. Anthropological accounts from the 19th century, recorded by observers who lived among plains peoples, provide some of these details, though filtered through cultural biases and incomplete understanding. George Catlin, a painter who spent years documenting indigenous life in the Ichenbapite centers, described entering a winter tipi and finding the interior surprisingly warm, the air comfortable enough that inhabitants wore relatively light clothing, despite brutal cold outside. He noted the fire burning steadily in the center, the smoke rising cleanly through the opening at the top, the buffalo robes arranged around the perimeter both as insulation and as bedding. Yet even these accounts leave mysteries. How exactly did families manage moisture control? The condensation that would inevitably form in a sealed, warm space in freezing. Archaeological evidence suggests the use of inner liners, separate coverings hung inside the main structure, but the precise methodology. Modern attempts to replicate traditional winter tipis often struggle with problems that ancient practitioners somehow solved. The buffalo robe, that essential item of plains culture, presents another archaeological puzzle. Thousands upon thousands of these robes were traded to European and American merchants in the 18th and 19th centuries, yet relatively few survive in museum collections, and those that do survive are often in poor condition, being degraded over time. What we know comes from fragmented sources. The robes were made from buffalo hides, typically taken from animals killed in late fall when their winter coats were thickest. The preparation process was elaborate and labor-intensive, primarily the work of women. The hide had to be cleaned, scraped, stretched, worked until it became supple. Some robes retained the hair, others had the hair removed on one side. The best robes were further processed with mixtures of brains, liver, and other materials, creating leather that remained flexible even in extreme cold. But here is the mystery that material culture cannot entirely solve. Accounts from both indigenous peoples and from settlers who acquired these robes describe them as providing extraordinary warmth, superior to wool blankets or most manufactured items. Yet when modern craftspeople attempt to replicate the traditional process, the results, while good, often don't quite match the legendary warmth described in historical accounts. Something in the technique, some subtle aspect of the preparation or treatment, seems to have been lost. Archaeological excavations of winter camps reveal careful site selection that speaks to environmental knowledge. Winter camps were almost never on exposed hilltops or open plains. Instead, the evidence clusters in specific types of locations: creek bottoms with dense cottonwood growth that broke the wind, south-facing slopes that receive maximum sunlight, areas near hot springs where such geological features existed, canyon alcoves that provided overhead protection and natural windbreaks. The Hidatsa and Mandan peoples of the upper Missouri River region constructed earth lodges for winter habitation, substantial structures built partially underground, with heavy timber frames covered with layers of willow branches, grass, and finally earth. Archaeological remains of these lodges dot the bluffs along the Missouri. Excavation reveals sophisticated construction, entrance tunnels that prevented wind from blowing directly into the living space, central fire pits designed with air channels, arrangements that suggest careful planning for smoke dispersal and heat retention. But again, the physical remains tell only part of the story. How exactly did families manage cooking, smoke, and heating fires simultaneously? How was fresh air introduced without creating drafts that would destroy the warm environment? Contemporary descriptions suggest the interiors remained comfortable even in the worst weather, but the precise management techniques remain somewhat mysterious, known imperfectly through oral traditions and fragmentary accounts. The settlers who arrived in the West brought their own traditions, their own understanding of cold weather survival, often rooted in European or Eastern American experiences. These techniques sometimes worked adequately, sometimes it failed catastrophically, and sometimes were gradually modified as settlers learned from indigenous neighbors and from harsh experience. The classic settler cabin, logs notched and stacked, the gaps chinked with mud or moss, was a transplanted technology derived from Scandinavian and German. In forested regions where timber was plentiful, these structures could be made reasonably warm. But on the plains, where trees were scarce, settlers often had to make do with sod, cutting thick rectangles of prairie sod, grass roots, and all, and stacking them into walls. Archaeological investigations of abandoned soddy sites reveal interesting patterns. The structures were often partially excavated into hillsides, using the earth itself as insulation. The roofs were supported by whatever timber could be scavenged, often cottonwood poles, and then covered with layers of sod. From a distance, these dwellings would have been almost invisible, blending into the landscape. Yet living in a soddy presented challenges that historical accounts describe vividly. The sod walls were excellent insulation in theory, but they harbored insects, they shed dirt constantly, and they required regular maintenance. Water seepage during thaw was a persistent problem. Still, a well-built soddy properly maintained could be surprisingly warm, the thick earthen walls retaining heat effectively. The mystery of frontier survival often lies in the small techniques, the practical knowledge that was considered too obvious to record at the time, but which has since been forgotten. How exactly did settlers manage their bedding to maximize warmth? We know they used layers, quilts, blankets, buffalo robes if they could acquire them, sometimes coats and other clothing piled on top. We know they often slept in their clothes, or most of them, We know that heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth were placed in beds as temporary warmers, but the precise arrangements, the optimal layering strategies, the techniques for managing moisture from breath and bodies, these details were rarely written down. They were embodied knowledge, passed from parent to child, learned through cold nights of trial and error. Archaeological evidence from military forts provides another window into winter survival strategies. Fort Laramie, Fort Fetterman, Fort Phil Kearny. Excavations at these sites reveal how the U.S. Army attempted to house soldiers through plains winters. The barracks were typically log or frame structures, long rectangular buildings designed to house dozens of men. Stoves, large cast iron affairs, were spaced along the building's length. Yet accounts from soldiers stationed at these forts speak of intense cold, of water freezing in buckets beside the stove, of men sleeping in their overcoats under piles of blankets, of ice forming on interior walls. Why did these structures, built with more resources and labor than most settler cabins, still fail to provide adequate warmth? Part of the answer lies in scale. Heating a large space with multiple small stoves is less efficient than heating a small space with a single stove. Part lies in construction quality. Military construction was often rushed, contracts went to low bidders, corners were cut. But part may lie in the loss of traditional knowledge, the failure to incorporate indigenous building techniques, or the accumulated wisdom of cold climate architecture. Some cultural practices around winter survival remain puzzling even now. There are accounts, difficult to verify but persistent in frontier narratives, of families or groups who survived extreme cold through practices that seem almost incredible. Like stories of people buried in snow, using the snow itself as insulation, surviving nights that would have killed them if exposed. The physics are sound. Deep snow can provide significant insulation, and body heat in an enclosed space can create survivable conditions. But the psychological dimension, the courage or desperation required to deliberately bury yourself in snow, speaks to extremes most of us can barely imagine. Accounts exist of travelers caught in blizzards who killed horses or cattle and sheltered inside the body cavities, using the animal's residual heat and the body as a windbreak. Archaeological evidence cannot confirm or deny these stories. Such desperate shelters would leave little trace, but they persist in the historical record, suggesting that truth, exaggeration, and legend have intertwined. The question of diet and cold weather survival presents another area where indigenous knowledge and settler practice diverged significantly. Archaeological analysis of refuse middens from winter camps shows that plains peoples consumed high-fat diets during winter months, pemmican being perhaps the most famous example, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, providing exceptional caloric density. Settlers, by contrast, often subsisted on far less optimal winter diets. Salt pork and beans, cornmeal, flour. These staples provided calories but often lacked the fats necessary for maintaining body heat in extreme cold. Accounts of scurvy, of winter-related illnesses, of general debilitation are common in settler narratives, but notably absent from descriptions of indigenous winter life, suggesting significant differences in nutritional adequacy. Yet the knowledge transfer was incomplete and often one-directional. Some settlers learned from indigenous neighbors, adopted techniques, integrated traditional knowledge with their own practices. Others, isolated by distance or culture or simple stubbornness, reinvented solutions or suffered for lack of them. Mountain men, the trappers and traders who penetrated the Rocky Mountains in the early 19th century, often adopted indigenous survival techniques wholesale. They wore buckskins, used buffalo robes, learned to read weather signs, and select sheltered camps. Their survival depended on this cultural adaptation. Yet even their knowledge was sometimes imperfect, filtered through incomplete understanding. Archaeological sites from trapping-era camps show interesting hybrid practices. European metal trade goods, kettles, knives, traps, combined with traditional indigenous materials, shelters that blend teepee designs with log construction. artifact assemblages that speak to cultural mixing and practical adaptation. And the ultimate mystery, perhaps, is this: why did so much of this knowledge fade so quickly? Within a generation or two of the frontier's closing, many winter survival techniques had been forgotten or existed only in fragmentary form. The widespread adoption of modern heating, the shift away from subsistence living, the disruption of indigenous cultures, all contributed to the loss. Today, experimental archaeologists and outdoor educators attempt to reconstruct these techniques, working from the physical evidence and the fragmentary written accounts. They build teepas according to traditional specifications, prepare buffalo robes using described methods, construct earth lodges based on archaeological patterns. Their experiences provide insights but also highlight what remains unknown. Modern winter campers, sleeping in high-tech fabrics and synthetic insulations, still struggle with cold that indigenous peoples navigated with organic materials and accumulated knowledge. The difference lies not in the materials necessarily, but in the depth of experiential understanding, the subtle techniques refined over time. Let your mind rest now with these mysteries. The winter camps, whose exact warmth management strategies we can only partly reconstruct. The survival techniques passed down through generations and then lost. The hybrid knowledge of settlers learning incompletely from traditions thousands of years old. These puzzles remain scattered across the archaeological landscape of the West, whispering their partial truths. You are warm now, comfortable in your modern shelter with its reliable heat. The mysteries of past survival need not trouble you. Let them fade like smoke from a long extinguished fire. Let us shift our perspective now, turning from the harsh realities of line camps and sod houses, to examine how winter was experienced by those with greater resources, those whose wealth or position provided some insulation, though never complete, from the season's worst privations. The contrast illuminates not just differences in comfort, but differences in the very nature of winter as a lived experience. Picture yourself arriving at the Inter-Ocean Hotel in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, in January of Ichenbat-Batar-San. The town has grown rapidly in the decades since the Union Pacific Railroad reached it, transforming from a raw collection of tents and shanties into something approximating civilization. The hotel itself stands 3 stories tall, its brick facade and large windows declaring its ambitions toward elegance. Again, you step from the brutal cold of the street, temperature hovering near zero, wind driving down from the mountains, into a lobby heated by a massive coal-burning furnace in the basement. The transition is almost shocking. Your frost-rimmed eyebrows begin to thaw, your cheeks tingling as blood flow returns. A clerk at the mahogany desk greets you with professional courtesy, his appearance neat, his hands uncaloused, his experience of winter fundamentally different from that of the cowboy or homesteader. And the lobby itself speaks of aspirations toward Eastern refinement. Carpets cover the floors, not rough planking or packed earth, but actual carpets, patterned and thick. Gas lamps provide light in the evenings, their mantles glowing steadily, far superior to the flickering candles or smoky oil lamps of frontier cabins. Upholstered chairs and settees offer seating, and there, against one wall, stands a source of particular fascination, a large coal stove ornate with nickel plating and decorative ironwork, radiating warmth into the common space. Kennex, your room on the second floor continues the theme of relative luxury. The bed is an actual bedstead, with a metal frame, not a simple cot or pile of blankets on the floor. Multiple quilts and blankets are provided, likely not as many as you'd pile on a bed in an isolated cabin, because the building's central heating reaches even here, keeping the room at temperatures that, while cool by modern standards, are vastly warmer than the unheated bedrooms of typical frontier dwellings. A washstand holds a porcelain pitcher and basin. Water is available, not from melting snow, but from the hotel's supply, possibly pumped from a well or hauled in barrels, kept from freezing in the heated building. You can actually wash your face, your hands, in water that hasn't been grudgingly melted from ice. The luxury of this simple act cannot be overstated for someone accustomed to frontier conditions. Okay? The hotel dining room serves meals at set hours. You descend to find white tablecloths, actual china plates, silverware, glasses for water or wine. The menu offers choices, not the monotonous beans and salt pork of the line camp, but beefsteaks, perhaps venison, potatoes prepared in various styles, vegetables that have been preserved or shipped from distances, bread that is fresh baked by hotel staff. Coffee flows freely, sugar is available without rationing, and for those who can afford it, there are luxuries, dried fruits, preserves, even oysters shipped packed in ice from the coasts. The other guests in the dining room represent the West's emerging elite and transient prosperity, cattle barons whose ranches sprawl across thousands of acres, their winter spent not in line camps but in town, managing operations from offices and meeting rooms. Mining investors from San Francisco or Denver, evaluating opportunities in the surrounding territories. Army officers from nearby Fort Russell, enjoying a respite from fort life. Merchants whose stores profit from selling goods to homesteaders and ranchers. Gamblers, speculators, lawyers, occasional territorial politicians, all circulating through this heated space while outside the wind howls and the temperature plummets. And yet even here, even in this bastion of relative comfort, winter asserts itself. The hotel's heating system, advanced as it is for the frontier, cannot fully overcome the cold. Rooms on the third floor, farthest from the basement furnace, remain chilly despite the laboring boiler. Windows frost over on their interior surfaces during the coldest nights. Guests still sleep under substantial layers of bedding. The hallways, less heated than the rooms themselves, require quick passage. Your breath still visible in the air. And the financial cost of this comfort is substantial. A night at a hotel like the Inter-Ocean might cost $1 or more, a sum that represents several days' wages for a common laborer, a significant expense even for those with steady income. Extended winter residence in such establishments is a privilege reserved for the genuinely wealthy or those on expense accounts. Consider now a different setting, the commanding officer's quarters at Fort Laramie in eastern Wyoming. Here some rank and position manifest in material conditions that separate officers from enlisted men as distinctly as wealth separates hotel guests from homesteaders. The commanding officer's residence is a substantial frame house, often 2 stories, painted white, with multiple rooms including separate parlors, dining rooms, bedrooms, and perhaps a study, while not palatial by Eastern standards. It represents extraordinary luxury compared to the cramped barracks where enlisted soldiers sleep in rows, 40 or 60 men to a single long room. Inside the officer's house, a woman, the commanding officer's wife, manages a household that attempts to maintain genteel standards despite frontier conditions. She has brought furniture from the East, or acquired it at considerable expense from suppliers in Denver or Cheyenne. There are curtains at the windows, not for mere decoration, but to provide additional insulation against the cold that presses through the glass. Carpets cover the wooden floors, again serving dual purposes of aesthetics and warmth. Multiple stoves heat the house, one in the parlor, another in the kitchen, perhaps a third upstairs. The officer's household receives generous allocations of coal or wood. The Army's supply trains ensure that officers' families have adequate fuel, even when enlisted men in the barracks shiver under inadequate blankets with insufficient heating. The officer's wife might spend her winter days engaged in pursuits that would seem absurdly refined given the frontier context. She reads actual books, subscriptions to magazines from the East, newspapers that arrive weeks late but still provide connection to the broader world. She does needlework, perhaps practices on a piano shipped at great expense and effort to this remote post. She receives social calls from other officers' wives, maintaining rituals of afternoon tea and formal visits that seem transported intact from drawing rooms in Boston or Philadelphia, yet her comfort is fundamentally constrained by context. She cannot simply turn up a thermostat or call for more heat. She must still plan her movements around the warmth, staying in heated rooms, timing any venture into unheated spaces for speed, wearing layers even indoors. Her servants, often enlisted men detailed to officers' households, must still haul water, carry coal, manage the stoves that make her comparative comfort possible. The food available to her household far exceeds what enlisted men receive. Officers can purchase supplies from the post sutler, can afford the inflated prices that remoteness and scarcity demand. Her table might feature items that a homesteader wouldn't see for months. Tinned goods from the east, dried fruits, coffee and tea of good quality, sugar and flour that haven't been adulterated or stretched with cheaper substitutes. If social gatherings among the officer class continue through winter, though modified by the season's constraints, there are dinners, carefully planned affairs where multiple households contribute dishes, where the best china makes an appearance, where conversation attempts to maintain civilized discourse despite the isolation and hardship surrounding the fort. The fort. There are dances in the post hall, enlisted men's band providing music, the room heated to near uncomfortable levels by multiple stoves, the officers and their wives dressed as formally as their wardrobes and circumstances. These gatherings serve purposes beyond mere entertainment. They maintain social structures, reinforce hierarchies, provide psychological relief from the monotony and isolation of frontier military life. They create temporarily the illusion that civilization persists even here, even in this remote outpost surrounded by hostile distances. Yet the illusion is always partial, always temporary. Beyond the lighted windows of the officers' quarters, beyond the music and conversation of the dance hall, the winter waits, indifferent to rank, unconcerned with social pretension. Officers have frozen to death when caught away from the fort in blizzards. Officers' wives have suffered from the isolation, from the crude medical care available, from diseases that better facilities might have prevented or cured. And the contrast between officer and enlisted man is perhaps most stark in sleeping arrangements. The enlisted barracks, as mentioned, house dozens of men in a single room. Cots are arranged in tight rows, allowing minimal personal space. 2 or 3 stoves attempt to heat the entire space, their warmth dissipating long before reaching the far corners. Men sleep in their uniforms, under thin army-issue blankets that provide inadequate insulation. The air in the barracks is thick with the breathing of many men, with the smell of unwashed bodies, bathing in winter being a rare luxury, with the smoke that leaks from the stoves. Cafetings of furs prefer preachings furs as impos. Meanwhile, the commanding officer sleeps in a proper bed in a private room, heated to relative comfort, his wife beside him, his children in their own rooms nearby. The disparity is absolute, visible, a daily reminder of how power and position translate into physical comfort. Consider now the experience of the wealthy rancher, a man who has succeeded in the cattle business during the boom years before the big die. He might maintain multiple residences, a ranch headquarters where operations are managed, a house in the nearest town for winter quarters, perhaps even a residence in Denver or Cheyenne for the coldest months. In his ranch house, unlike the crude line camps where his employees suffer, is a substantial building. 2 stories, multiple rooms, well constructed with milled lumber rather than rough logs. The construction quality is superior. Properly fitted windows, solid doors, careful attention to eliminating drafts. Multiple stoves or even a furnace system provide heat. A kitchen with a proper range allows for varied cooking. A dining room permits formal meals. Yet even this relative luxury is qualified by frontier realities. The rancher and his family are still isolated, miles from neighbors, dependent on supplies laid in before winter. Close the roads. Medical emergencies are still potentially fatal. A serious illness or injury, a difficult childbirth, could not be adequately treated with the resources available. The winter still constrains, still limits, still poses genuine dangers. The rancher's wife lives in a curious middle space. She has more comfort than a homesteader's wife, more resources, more help, perhaps servants, certainly ranch hands who can be directed to various tasks. Yet she's still far from the society and amenities she might have known in the East. She's still isolated, still subjected to months of confinement to the house and immediate surroundings, still aware of the dangers that winter poses. Their children experience winter differently from children in humbler circumstances. They have adequate clothing, proper boots, warm coats. They have enough to eat, a variety of foods that homestead children might only dream of. They have a warm house, their own beds, perhaps books and toys. Yet they too are confined, trapped by the weather, their world contracted to the rooms of the house, the occasional bundled venture to the barn or nearby outbuildings. Education for these children might continue through winter, a governess brought from the East, or parents educated enough to teach, or in town, an actual school in a heated building where children of the elite and the middling classes gather. This contrasts sharply with homestead children, whose education halts entirely during winter months or continues only sporadically when weather permits. In the larger frontier towns, Cheyenne, Denver, Deadwood, an urban elite emerges by the Ichenbabai bashers, people whose wealth derives from mines, from trade, from successful speculation in land or cattle. They build substantial houses, sometimes mansions by frontier standards. They install the latest improvements, coal furnaces, indoor plumbing where water can be pumped and drained, gas lighting, telegraph connections. These townhouses represent islands of civilization, attempts to recreate Eastern comfort in a Western setting. The interiors feature wallpaper, elaborate woodwork, carpeted floors, proper furniture. Kitchens are equipped with the latest ranges and implements. Bedrooms are appointed with substantial beds, wardrobes, washstands. Parlors display pianos, bookcases, decorative objects that signal culture and refinement. The families in these houses maintain social calendars that would be familiar to their counterparts in eastern cities. There are charity events, literary societies, musical evenings, formal dinners. The women wear fashionable clothing, orders from San Francisco or Chicago arriving by rail. The men conduct business in heated offices, their hands soft, their faces unmarked by weather. Yet even they cannot entirely escape winter's reach. The town's streets become impassable during blizzards, snow piling in drifts that isolate neighborhoods. Coal supplies, while generally adequate for the wealthy, can run short during severe winters, forcing even the elite to ration heat. Illness spreads through towns regardless of class. Influenza, pneumonia, scarlet fever make no distinction between the mansion and the shanty. And there is always the awareness, impossible to fully suppress, of the contrast between their comfort and the suffering of others. They know, because they cannot help but know, that while they sit in heated parlors, cowboys freeze in line camps. While they enjoy elaborate meals, homesteaders ration flour and hope their provisions last until spring. While they sleep under comfortable blankets in warm rooms, soldiers huddle in inadequate barracks, and isolated people struggle through nights that could kill them. Some respond to this awareness with genuine charity, organizing relief efforts, donating funds, opening their homes to those stranded in town during storms. Others maintain a careful emotional, a cultivation of ignorance that allows them to enjoy their privileges without confronting too directly the cost others pay. The servants who make elite comfort possible, cooks, maids, housekeepers, groundskeepers, occupy their own intermediate position. They work in heated houses but often sleep in unheated or poorly heated servants' quarters. They handle abundant food while receiving plain fare for their own meals. They maintain the visible spaces of wealth while their own accommodations remain crude. Their winter is easier than a homesteader's, harder than their employer's, a daily navigation of boundaries and disparities. As spring approaches and the severity of winters like the Big Die becomes apparent, the gulf between the comfortable and the desperate widens dramatically. The wealthy rancher who has wintered in Denver returns to find his herds decimated, but retains resources to rebuild. The homesteader who has barely survived finds his few cattle dead, his seed grain consumed, his debt increased, his options narrowed or eliminated entirely. The officer at the fort has weathered winter in relative comfort. The enlisted man has endured it in hardship that will affect his health for months or years. The hotel guest has experienced winter as an inconvenience, a period of reduced travel and confined social activity. The cowboy has experienced it as a sustained struggle for survival. Let these contrasts settle in your mind now. The heated hotel lobby and the frozen line camp, the officer's warm house and the drafty barracks, the wealthy rancher's substantial home and the homesteader's sod dugout, all existing simultaneously, separated by miles and by unbridgeable differences in resources and power. You lie now in your own comfortable bed, in your own warm room, neither enduring the desperate hardship of the frontier poor nor enjoying the qualified luxury of the frontier elite. You exist in a different world entirely, one where warmth is reliable, where winter is managed through technology those people could not have imagined. Let yourself feel grateful for that comfort. Let the awareness of past struggles and past disparities fade into the gentle darkness of approaching sleep. The cold of history cannot reach you here. You are safe, you are warm, let that be enough. And so we come to the end of our journey through the frozen winters of the Old West, through the daily struggles and the catastrophic seasons, through the mysteries of lost knowledge and the stark contrasts of privilege and privation. What remains when we look back across these stories? Perhaps simply this, the recognition that human beings have endured, have survived, have made lives in conditions that would overwhelm most of us today. The settlers in their crude cabins, the cowboys in their line camps, the indigenous peoples with their accumulated wisdom, the soldiers in their forts, all of them faced winters with resources we would consider impossibly inadequate, and most of them survived, carried on, continued building the lives they'd chosen or the lives they'd been forced into. Their winters were measured not in inconvenience but in constant labor, not in discomfort but in genuine danger. Every day required effort simply to maintain the basic conditions of survival. Every night was a small victory if you woke to see morning. The cold was not a background condition but an active presence, something to be fought against every hour. Yet within that hardship there were must have been moments of quiet satisfaction. The fire catching cleanly on a bitter morning, a child sleeping peacefully under warm blankets, a meal shared with family or companions, the first truly warm day of spring, when you knew you'd survived another winter. Small graces that punctuated the difficulty, that made the struggle seem worthwhile, or at least bearable. We cannot truly know what those winters felt like. Not really. We can read the accounts, examine the evidence, imagine ourselves into their circumstances, but we remain separated by the fundamental comfort of our modern existence. We have never been truly cold in the way they were cold. We have never felt the exhaustion of maintaining warmth through endless frozen months. We have never known the specific anxiety of watching provisions dwindle while winter shows no sign of ending. And perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps progress means, among other things, that each generation suffers less from some of the hardships that their ancestors endured. The settlers and cowboys and soldiers of the Old West struggled so that later generations might not have to. Their endurance purchased, eventually, a world where winter is managed, where cold is controlled, where survival is no longer in question. And so, as you settle deeper into sleep, let yourself appreciate the warmth surrounding you, the reliable heat, the comfortable bed, the certainty that morning will come without struggle. These are gifts purchased through human ingenuity and effort across generations. And let the images of the past fade now. The frost-rimmed windows, the struggling fires, the endless white landscapes, the cold that penetrated everything. They are history safely contained in the past, unable to touch you here. Your breathing has slowed, deepened. Your body has relaxed into the comfort of your bed. The room is warm, the darkness is gentle, and sleep waits patiently for you to surrender to it. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to resolve. Simply let go. Let the stories drift away like smoke, let the past recede into comfortable distance. You are warm, you are safe. You are home, sleep well, friend. Sleep well, welcome, and settle yourself comfortably wherever you are. Let the demands of your day begin to fade like distant echoes across a fjord. Tonight, We journey together to a time and place where survival itself was an art, where the cold was not merely an inconvenience, but a constant, testing presence that shaped every aspect of existence. Kenna, we're traveling to the far northern reaches of the Viking world, to those settlements that clung to life in landscapes where winter darkness stretched for months, where the sea itself could freeze, and where the temperature could plummet to depths that would seem unimaginable to most of us today. These were not the raiding Vikings of popular imagination, not yet. These were the farmers, the fishermen, the families who made their homes in places that tested human ingenuity and endurance in ways that few environments ever have. You might imagine the Arctic Viking settlements as desperate, precarious places, communities barely clinging to survival. And while life was undeniably harsh, what we discover when we look closely is something far more remarkable. These people didn't merely survive. They developed sophisticated systems, knowledge passed down through generations, and architectural innovations that allowed them not just to endure, but to build lasting communities in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Tonight we'll explore how they did it. How did families stay warm when temperatures plunged far below freezing? How did they find food when the land was locked in ice and darkness? What did their days look like, their nights, their long waiting for spring? We'll walk through their homes, share their meals, understand their strategies, and perhaps gain a deeper appreciation for the ingenuity of people who lived so differently from us, yet shared the same fundamental human needs: warmth, safety, sustenance, and community. Okay. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders relax, allow yourself to drift backwards through time, northward across cold seas, to a world where smoke rose from turf-roofed longhouses, where the aurora danced overhead, and where survival demanded both profound practical knowledge and an acceptance of nature's overwhelming power. Let us begin. Imagine yourself waking in darkness. Not the darkness of a winter morning in our modern world where dawn is merely delayed, but true, deep darkness. It is midwinter in a Viking settlement in northern Norway, perhaps near what we now call Tromsø, though no such name exists yet. The year is sometime in the late Goth century. Outside, the sun will not rise today, nor tomorrow. It hasn't risen for weeks, and it won't for weeks more. This is the polar night, the Myrkid, the time of murk. You lie on a sleeping platform built into the wall of the longhouse, wrapped in layers of wool blankets and furs, sheepskin, perhaps reindeer hide if your family has been fortunate in trade or hunting. The air near your face is cold enough that you can see your breath, a faint mist in the dim glow from the central hearth, which has been kept burning through the night. Someone, likely one of the older members of the household, or perhaps whoever's watch it was, has been tending that fire, adding peat or carefully split wood, ensuring it never dies completely. A dead fire in winter could mean death itself. The longhouse around you is long and narrow, perhaps 60 feet from end to end, but only about 15 feet wide. The walls are thick, so thick that you could extend your arm and not reach through them. They are made of turf, layer upon layer of earth and grass roots, cut into blocks and stacked with the precision of stonework. Beneath the turf, there is often a framework of wood or stone, depending on what materials are readily available. Some of the more prosperous households have timber walls with turf insulation packed around them. The roof above is similarly constructed, wooden beams supporting thick turf, creating a living layer of insulation that grows heavier when wet, but also denser and more protective against the cold. The floor beneath you is packed earth, covered in places with wooden planks, especially near the central hearth and along the main walkway. Layers of dried grass, reeds, and even sand have been spread over the earth, changed periodically when they become too soiled or damp. The smell in the longhouse is thick and complex. Smoke from the peat fire, which carries a distinctive, earthy sweetness. The smell of wool, both clean and worn. The faint odor of fish oil from the lamps. Animal scents from the cattle and sheep housed at one end of the building. Human bodies in close quarters. And the pervasive smell of aging food stores. You rise slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth of your furs. The air is layered, warmer near the ceiling, where smoke gathers before finding its way out through gaps in the roof, and coldest near the floor. You dress in layers. First, an inner layer of linen if your family has been able to produce or trade for it, though wool directly against the skin is more common this far north. Then tunic and trousers of thick wool. The wool here is different from what you might imagine. The sheep of this region produce wool with long, coarse outer fibers and soft, insulating inner fibers. When woven and felted properly, this wool is remarkably resistant to wind and moisture. Over this, another layer, perhaps a heavier woolen overdress or cloak. On your feet, shoes of leather stuffed with dried grass for insulation. Some people wrap their lower legs with wool winningas, leg wrappings, which provide both warmth and protection. The longhouse is beginning to stir. You can hear others moving in the darkness, the soft sounds of people dressing, the murmur of low voices. Voices. Privacy is scarce in these dwellings. An extended family shares this space, perhaps 15 to 25 people in total. Grandparents, parents, children, unmarried siblings, perhaps a few thralls, enslaved people captured in raids or born into servitude. The social hierarchy is visible even in the sleeping arrangements. The family head and his wife occupy the high seat area, near the center of the longhouse where the fire burns warmest and brightest. Other family members are arranged in order of status and age. The thralls sleep nearest the doors, where the cold is most invasive, or in the spaces near the animals. At the far end of the longhouse, separated by low wooden partitions or hanging woolen dividers, you can hear the cattle shifting. In deep winter, the animals are brought inside, not out of pure sentiment, though these animals represent wealth and survival, but for practical reasons that benefit both human and beast. The animal's body heat contributes to warming the longhouse. A single cow produces significant warmth, and several cows, along with sheep and perhaps a few goats, can raise the interior temperature noticeably. In exchange, the animals are protected from the brutal cold that could kill them. Still, the winter is hard on the livestock. Their fodder, dried grass and hay collected laboriously during the brief summer, must be carefully rationed. The animals grow thin over winter, and some, especially the weaker ones, will not survive until spring. And the central hearth is a long rectangular pit lined with stones, running down the middle of the longhouse. The fire is never positioned directly in the center of the room, but slightly off to one side, allowing people to move around it. The stones that line it are chosen carefully. Certain stones can explode when heated, sending dangerous fragments flying. The fuel for this fire has been gathered over months of preparation. Peat, cut from bogs during summer and dried in the wind, burns slowly and provides steady heat, though its smoke is heavy. Wood is precious this far north, where trees are stunted and scarce, so it is used sparingly, split into thin pieces to make it last. Driftwood, carried by currents and collected from beaches, is a valued resource. Some households burn seal or whale blubber in special stone lamps, which provide both heat and light, though the smell is thick and oily. Can you move toward the fire, joining others who are already there? An elderly woman is warming her hands, her face deeply lined, her back bent from decades of labor. A child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, sits close to the flames, staring into them with the absorbed fascination of the very young. The household is beginning the slow process of waking to another day of darkness. Breakfast is simple. A portion of skyr, a thick cultured dairy product similar to yogurt, tangy and filling, is brought out from the storage area. Dried fish is passed around, the flesh hard and requiring significant chewing, but rich with the protein and fat that bodies need to generate heat. Some households have flatbread, made from barley flour ground on quernstones, baked on flat stones near the fire. Fresh bread is a luxury in deepest winter. Most bread is made in quantity when possible and stored, becoming harder and drier over time. A weak ale, stored in barrels or large ceramic vessels, is drunk throughout the day. The water, when not frozen, can be unsafe. And ale, even weak ale, is both safer and provides calories. Children drink it. Everyone drinks it. The alcohol content is low enough that intoxication is not the goal. Sustenance is. After the meal, the work begins. There is always work, even in the dark months, perhaps especially in the dark months when boredom and darkness can become oppressive. The women of the household gather near the fire with their handwork. Some work at spinning, using drop spindles to transform cleaned carded wool into thread. The motion is rhythmic, almost meditative. The spindle dropped, spun, the wool drawn out from the distaff, the thread wound up over and over. Others weave at the warp-weighted loom that stands against one wall, the stone or clay weights hanging from the vertical threads, clacking gently as the weaver works the horizontal weft through. The fabric that emerges is dense and sturdy, the product of hundreds of hours of labor. Sewing and mending never cease. Clothing is precious. A single woolen tunic represents an enormous investment of time. The sheep must be raised, sheared, the wool cleaned and carded, spun into thread, woven into cloth, and finally cut and sewn. When a garment tears or wears thin, it is repaired, patched, and when it can no longer be worn, it is repurposed. Worn-out clothing becomes cleaning rags, patches for other garments, or stuffing for bedding. The men of the household attend to their own tasks. Some work on tool repair and creation. A farmer sharpens his scythe blade on a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping sound filling the longhouse. Another carves a new handle for an axe, working the wood carefully with a knife, testing the fit repeatedly. Nets are mended, knots checked and retied, holes rewoven with careful fingers. In a settlement this far north, fishing is not a summer-only activity. When weather permits, men venture out to fish through holes cut in the sea ice, a dangerous and cold endeavor that nevertheless provides crucial protein during the lean months. There is also the constant work of maintaining the fire, of fetching water if there is a source that hasn't frozen solid, of checking the animals and distributing their fodder, monitoring the food stores. The storage areas of the longhouse are carefully organized. Barrels of salted and dried fish stand in the coolest areas. Wheels of cheese, made during the summer when the animals were producing milk, are stacked and aging. Sacks of barley and oats, precious grains grown during the brief growing season, are guarded carefully and measured out sparingly. Smoked and dried meat hangs from the rafters. Seal meat, reindeer if the hunting was successful, occasionally whale meat from a stranded animal or a successful hunt. The entire household depends on these stores lasting until spring, and the calculation is always present in everyone's mind. Too generous with portions and you risk starvation in late winter. Too stingy and you weaken your family's ability to work and survive. As the day progresses, though day is perhaps the wrong word, when no sun rises, there is a rhythm to the activities. The children, when not helping with age-appropriate tasks, play games. They have small carved figures, animals, and people which they move through imaginary scenarios. They play knucklebones, a game of skill and chance using the ankle bones of sheep. The older children, particularly the boys, practice with small wooden swords or spears, supervised by fathers and uncles who know that survival may one day depend on their ability to fight or hunt. Girls practice with miniature looms and spindles, learning the skills that will define much of their adult lives. Stories are told. In the long darkness, storytelling becomes not just entertainment but education, cultural transmission, and a way to mark time. An elder recounts tales of ancestors, of the gods Odin, Thor, Freya, and of journeys to distant lands. Some stories are heroic, full of battles and glory. Others are practical, encoding information about weather patterns, navigation, and survival techniques in narrative form. A story about a hero who survived by eating a particular plant in winter might save a life someday. A tale about reading the stars for navigation passes on crucial knowledge. The children listen, rapt, and through repetition, these stories become part of their mental architecture. Midday brings another meal, similar to breakfast. More dried fish, perhaps some of the precious grain cooked into a porridge, thickened and filling. If a seal has been caught recently, there might be seal meat, either boiled or roasted. Seal blubber, though it seems unappetizing to modern sensibilities, is highly prized. Rich in calories and fat that burning bodies need. Some is eaten directly, some is rendered down for lamp fuel and cooking. In the afternoon, again a misnomer in the polar night. But the household maintains a rhythm regardless of the sun. Some of the more able-bodied members might venture outside, if weather permits. Weather permits is a crucial caveat. Storms can blow up with terrifying speed in these latitudes. Snow driven by howling winds can reduce visibility to zero within minutes. The cold can be lethal. Exposed skin can freeze in moments, and getting lost, even just yards from your own door, can mean death. So people venture out with caution, in groups when possible, always with an awareness of the risks. But venture out they must. Wood and peat must be brought in from outdoor storage. Snow might need to be cleared from doorways or from the roof of the longhouse. Too much accumulated snow can cause a roof to collapse. The animals need to be checked. And sometimes simply being outside, even in the cold and dark, becomes necessary for mental health. The longhouse can feel oppressive, the air thick and stale, the proximity of bodies overwhelming. A brief walk in the freezing air, looking up at the stars or the shifting curtains of the aurora borealis, can be restorative. The aurora is a frequent visitor here. On clear nights, the northern lights dance across the sky in sheets and ribbons of green, sometimes pink, occasionally red. The people of this time have their own explanations for this phenomenon. Some believe it is the reflection of light off the shields of the Valkyries, others that it is a bridge to the realm of the gods. Regardless of the interpretation, the aurora is a source of wonder, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is beauty. Evening approaches, marked not by failing light but by the household's internal clock, by hunger, by tiredness. The evening meal is prepared, often the largest meal of the day. On a fortunate day, there might be a stew made in a large soapstone pot or iron cauldron hung over the fire. Chunks of preserved meat, dried peas or beans, barley, perhaps some dried seaweed, all simmer together into a thick, nutritious mass. The pot has been simmering for hours, and the smell has been filling the longhouse, building appetite. Bowls are brought out, wooden bowls, usually, sometimes carved from a single piece of wood, sometimes carved soapstone, and the stew is ladled out. People eat with wooden spoons, or with flat pieces of flatbread used to scoop up the food. The meal is eaten slowly, savored, the warmth of the food spreading through tired bodies. After the meal, there is a period of communal activity. More stories might be told. Sometimes, if the mood is right and someone has the energy, there is music. A simple wooden flute might emerge, or a drum made from stretched hide. The songs are often slow, rhythmic, sometimes mournful, sometimes celebratory, evoking the sea, the seasons, the gods, the ancestors. Some songs are work songs, their rhythm designed to coordinate group efforts. Rowing songs, grinding songs, weaving songs. Sung now in the longhouse, they serve to maintain cultural memory and provide comfort. As the night deepens, though again, the night here is no darker than the day, people begin to retire to their sleeping areas. Children are wrapped in furs and settled on the sleeping platforms. The very young might sleep between their parents for warmth and safety. The elderly are helped to their rest, their bodies aching from the cold and from age. The fire is banked for the night, not extinguished, never extinguished if it can be helped, but dampened down, covered with ash to slow its burn, conserve fuel, and ensure coals remain alive until morning. Someone, perhaps working in shifts, will maintain the watch through the night, adding fuel when needed, ensuring the fire's survival. You lie down again, wrapped once more in your furs, the sounds of the longhouse settling around you, the soft breathing of sleepers, the occasional sound from the animals, the crackle of the banked fire. Outside, the wind moans around the turf walls, but the walls hold. They have held for years, and they will hold through this night as well. The cold presses in from all sides, relentless and patient, but here, inside, there is warmth enough, food enough, company enough. This is survival, but it is also life. It is ordinary, and it is remarkable. These people have not merely adapted to one of Earth's harshest environments. They have created a culture within it, a way of life that sustains not just bodies but spirits. This will eventually end. Spring will return, as it always has, though in the depths of winter, that can be hard to imagine. For now there is this, the warmth of the fire, the presence of family, the rhythm of work and rest, and the deep, hard-won knowledge that they can endure. Let yourself rest now, in this place and time. Feel the weight of the furs, the warmth of the fire, the safety of these thick walls. Let the rhythm of this life, so different from your own, carry you gently toward sleep. The story of how Viking peoples came to inhabit the most remote, dark, and challenging northern territories is inextricably linked to individual human decisions, as ambitions and often necessity. To understand how communities learn to survive Arctic winters, we must first understand why they ventured to such places at all, and how the knowledge of survival was built, generation by generation, through trial, error, and sometimes tragedy. Let us turn our attention to Iceland, a land that in the late Joth century was uninhabited by humans, a volcanic island rising from the North Atlantic, covered in glaciers and lava fields, battered by storms, and locked in ice and darkness for much of the year. This was not a promised land in any conventional sense, and yet within a few decades it would be home to tens of thousands of Norse settlers. So, the traditional accounts tell us that the first permanent Norse settler was a man named Ingolfur Arnarson, and through his story we can trace the arc of Norse settlement in the far north. Ingolfur Arnarson was a Norwegian chieftain, born sometime around Bapbite AD in the region of Rogaland in southwestern Norway. Our knowledge of him comes primarily from the Landnamabok, the Book of Settlements, a medieval Icelandic text compiled in the 3rd and 4th centuries, recording the names and stories of Iceland's first settlers. Like all such sources from this period, it blends historical memory with legend, family pride, and cultural values. Yet within it we can discern patterns that reflect real historical processes and individual human experiences. Ingolfur was not a poor man. He came from a family of some standing with property and connections. This is important to understand. The settlement of Iceland was not primarily undertaken by the desperate and dispossessed, at least not at first. It required resources, ships, supplies, livestock, tools, and people. A settlement voyage was an expensive and risky investment. Ingolfur, by the accounts, had the means to make such an investment, but he also had reasons that pushed him toward it. Norway in the late youth century was undergoing profound political changes. So, King Harald Fairhair was engaged in a long campaign to unify the various petty kingdoms and chieftaincies of Norway under his sole rule. This process, like most such consolidations of power, was violent, disruptive, and created winners and losers. Some chieftains submitted and retained their positions under Harald's overlordship. Others resisted and were defeated, their lands confiscated, their power broken. Still others, seeing the direction of events, chose to leave rather than submit. Like Ingolfur's decision to leave Norway was influenced by conflict, though the exact nature varies in different tellings. In some versions, he and his sworn brother, a man named Hjörleifur, killed the sons of a Norwegian earl in a dispute. Blood vengeance was demanded, and though compensation was eventually paid, a typical resolution in Norse society, where honor and blood could often be balanced with silver, the weight of this conflict, combined with the broader political instability, made Norway feel increasingly uncomfortable. In other accounts, it was simply the oppression of Harald's kingship, the loss of independence and autonomy that free chieftains had once enjoyed, that drove Ingolfur to seek new lands. Iceland had been discovered, or at least visited, by Norse sailors before Ingolfur. Irish monks may have lived there even earlier, seeking isolation for their religious devotions, though they left little trace and apparently departed when the Norse began arriving. A man named Floki Vilgerthursson had sailed to Iceland a few years before Ingolfur's settlement, explored it and given it its forbidding name, Riseland, Iceland, after seeing a fjord filled with drift ice. Floki's attempt at settlement had ended in failure. He had not prepared adequately for the winter. His livestock perished, his party nearly starved. He returned to Norway with a harsh assessment of the land, though others in his crew spoke more favorably of its potential. Ingólfur was more methodical. Before committing to permanent settlement, he first sailed to Iceland on an exploratory voyage. Probably around Babætters AD. He would have departed from Norway in late spring or early summer, when the weather was most favorable for ocean crossings. The voyage across the North Atlantic was never safe. The distance from Norway to Iceland is approximately loped miles across open ocean, and the seas are treacherous. Storms could rise without warning. Fog could leave you lost without landmarks. The currents were powerful and unpredictable. Ships were lost regularly, vanishing without trace, all aboard perishing in the cold waters. But Ingólfur's ship made the crossing successfully. It would have been a nar or a similar type of vessel, broader and deeper than the famous longships used for raiding, designed for cargo and ocean travel rather than speed and warfare. The ship would have carried Ingólfur, his family members, followers, thralls, and perhaps livestock, sheep, cattle, horses, and pigs. Also aboard would have been essential supplies, tools, weapons, seed grain, preserved food, and the portable wealth, silver, fine cloth, and trade goods that represented his life's accumulation. When Ingólfur first sighted Iceland, he would have seen a landscape unlike anywhere in Norway. The coast is dramatic, sheer cliffs rising from the sea, black volcanic beaches, mountains capped with ice, and everywhere the signs of volcanic activity. Steam rises from hot springs. Lava fields stretch in frozen, tortured shapes. The vegetation where it exists is low and scrubby, no trees to speak of, just grasses, mosses, and low shrubs. The wind is constant, often fierce. On this first exploratory voyage, Ingólfur and his party spent time surveying the land, understanding the resources, the challenges, the potential. They would have noted the presence of driftwood on beaches, crucial since Iceland had almost no native timber. They would have found freshwater sources, tested the soil, observed the vegetation that could serve as fodder for livestock. They would have seen the abundant seabird colonies, the seals, the fish in the coastal waters, and they would have experienced the climate. The long summer days where the sun barely set, and they would have had to imagine from their Norwegian experience what the winter darkness and cold would be like. Satisfied that settlement was viable, Ingólfur returned to Norway. He spent the next few years preparing for permanent settlement. He sold or settled his Norwegian properties, gathered his household, recruited followers, and assembled the supplies needed for establishing a new life in an uninhabited land. His sworn brother Hjörleifr prepared similarly, and when they departed Norway around Babætters AD, was with 2 ships, carrying their combined households, perhaps 50 to 70 people in total, and everything they would need to survive and establish farms in Iceland. And the sagas tell us that as Ingólfur approached Iceland's coast on this settlement voyage, he performed a traditional ritual. He took the high seat pillars from his Norwegian hall, carved wooden posts that represented the authority and sanctity of the household, and threw them overboard, vowing to settle wherever the gods caused them to wash ashore. This act was both religious and practical. It left the decision of where to settle to the divine powers, but it also ensured that Ingólfur would take time to explore the coast to find the best possible location, rather than simply settling at the first convenient landing site. The pillars did not wash ashore immediately, so Ingólfur made temporary camp on the southeastern coast, in a place he called Ingólfsfjörður. He sent thralls out to search the coastline for the pillars, while he and his party began the work of establishing a temporary settlement, building shelters, exploring the land, hunting and fishing, and beginning to understand this new environment. And meanwhile, Hjörleifr, Ingólfur's sworn brother, had taken a different approach. Hjörleifr was not willing to wait for divine guidance. He settled in the south of Iceland, near what is now called Hjörleifsfjörður, and immediately set his thralls to work preparing land for cultivation. But Hjörleifr had acquired his thralls through raiding in Ireland, and he treated them harshly. The Irish thralls, resentful of their enslavement and brutal treatment, plotted rebellion. One day, while Hjörleifr was working in the field, The thralls attacked and killed him and the other free men in his household. They took the women, the portable wealth, and the ship's boat, and fled to some small islands off the coast. And when Ingolfur learned of his sworn brother's death, he was faced with a crisis. Blood demanded blood. The thralls had committed murder and theft, the most serious crimes in Norse society. Ingolfur tracked them to the islands, now known as Vestmanna Ejar, the islands of the Westmen being the Norse term for the Irish. He found them there and killed them all in retribution. This act of vengeance was expected, necessary within the cultural framework. To leave such a crime unavenged would bring shame and demonstrate weakness, but it also meant the loss of valuable labor. Thralls represented wealth and productive capacity. Their deaths, alongside Hjörleifur's murder, meant that Ingolfur's settlement was diminished before it had truly begun. Eventually, after several years, Ingolfur's thralls found the high seat pillars. They had washed ashore in a bay on the southwestern coast, in a location marked by geothermal steam rising from the ground. The place that would become Reykjavik, Smoke Bay, now Iceland's capital. Ingolfur fulfilled his vow and moved his settlement there around Bat by Senfor, Bat by AD. Reykjavik, at the time Ingolfur settled there, was neither welcoming nor obviously superior to many other locations. It was a bay providing some shelter for ships. There was geothermal activity, which meant hot springs that could be used for bathing and perhaps for some cooking. It was grazing land for livestock. But there was also harsh wind, cold winters, and the same challenges that faced any settler in Iceland: isolation, limited resources, and the need to develop entirely new strategies for survival in a subarctic climate. Ingolfur and his household set to work building a permanent settlement. The first structures would have been simple: turf and stone buildings modeled on Norwegian farms but adapted to Icelandic conditions. The abundance of turf, layers of earth bound together by the oaks turfs, roots of grasses and mosses, made it the primary building material. Stone was readily available from the volcanic landscape. Timber was scarce, precious, and had to be used sparingly, reserved for structural elements like door frames, roof supports, and essential tools. The first winter would have been a test. Everything had to be learned anew. How much fodder did the animals need to survive the Icelandic winter, which was different from the Norwegian winter? How cold would it get? How much food did humans need to store? What fishing techniques worked in Icelandic waters? What fishing techniques worked in Icelandic waters? Which plants were safe to eat? How did you prevent your water source from freezing solid? Some of these lessons would have been learned the hard way. Livestock died, either from insufficient fodder, from the cold, or from diseases and parasites in the new environment. People likely went hungry at times, especially in that first winter, before they fully understood the land's rhythms. The margin for error was thin. A miscalculation in how much grain to save for seed versus how much to eat could mean starvation the following year. A failure to catch and preserve enough fish before winter could leave you without protein. A poorly constructed building could collapse under snow or fail to retain heat adequately, leading to frostbite, illness, and death. But Ingolfur's settlement survived. Not just survived, but became the foundation for further settlement. Other Norsemen and women, hearing that Iceland was habitable, that land was available for the taking, began arriving. The period from roughly Babætiris to Jolbætser AD is known as the settlement period, during which the entire habitable coastline of Iceland was claimed and settled. Thousands of people made the dangerous crossing from Norway, and also from Norse settlements in Scotland, Ireland, and the other islands of the North Atlantic. Each new settler had to learn what Ingolfur had learned: how to adapt Norwegian farming and living practices to the Icelandic environment. They brought with them sheep, cattle, horses, pigs, and goats. They brought barley seed, their most crucial grain, which could grow in Iceland's short, cool summers, though just barely. They brought their social structures, their legal traditions, their religious practices, and their determination to remain free and independent. Ingolfur lived into old age, by the standards of the time. He saw his settlement grow, saw more ships arrive, saw the landscape around Reykjavik gradually transformed by human habitation. He claimed a large territory, as was the right of a first settler, and parceled it out to his followers and to new arrivals, establishing himself as a figure of authority and respect. When he died, the exact date is not recorded, but likely sometime in the early 3rd century, he left behind not just descendants, but a legacy. He had proven that permanent settlement in Iceland was possible. He had established patterns and practices that subsequent settlers would follow and refine. The settlement of Iceland was, in many ways, a laboratory for Arctic and subarctic survival. Unlike in Greenland, which would be settled by Icelanders a century later, or in the Norse settlements in northern Norway and the Faroe Islands, Iceland was uninhabited. There were no indigenous people with existing knowledge of the land to learn from or displace. Everything had to be figured out through experimentation, observation, and the grim teacher of failure. They learned that Icelandic sheep, developed from the animals brought by the settlers, were remarkably hardy. Their wool had special properties, a long, water-resistant outer coat, and a soft, insulating undercoat that made them ideal for the climate. They learned that while barley could be grown in favorable years, the climate was marginal for agriculture, and livestock, fishing, and foraging had to provide the bulk of sustenance. They learned sophisticated techniques for preserving food. Fish were dried in the cold, dry wind, becoming hard as wood but remaining edible and nutritious for months or even years. Meat was smoked, salted, or preserved in fermented whey, a byproduct of cheese making. Dairy products were processed into forms that could be stored. Hard cheeses, skyr, and butter packed in barrels and buried in cool ground or snow. They learned to construct buildings that could withstand the wind and retain heat. Icelandic turf houses became increasingly sophisticated over the generations. They were built partially underground, taking advantage of the earth's insulation. The walls were immensely thick, sometimes 6 feet or more, creating a barrier against the cold. Entrance passages were designed as a series of angled corridors, preventing wind from blowing directly into the main living space. Sleeping platforms were built against the walls, where the bodies of sleepers themselves added to the warmth. They learned to exploit geothermal resources in ways that gave Iceland a unique advantage over other Arctic settlements. Hot springs were used for bathing, for washing clothes, for cooking, and even for heating buildings in some fortunate locations. The ability to bathe in hot water, even in midwinter, was not just a luxury. It was a significant health advantage, reducing skin diseases and parasites that plagued other medieval populations. They also learned the limits of the land. Iceland's ecosystem was fragile. The settlers brought sheep, and the sheep grazed. But Iceland had evolved without large grazing mammals, and its vegetation was not adapted to grazing pressure. The birch scrubland that had covered much of the lowlands was gradually destroyed, eaten by sheep, cut for firewood, and unable to regenerate under the combined pressures. This deforestation led to soil erosion. Without tree roots and vegetation to hold the soil, the wind carried it away. Farms that had been productive in the settlement period became marginal or uninhabitable within a few generations as the soil eroded into the sea. This environmental degradation was not understood in modern ecological terms. Of course, the settlers simply saw that some lands became less productive over time. They adapted by relying more heavily on the resources that remained constant. The sea, which provided fish, seals, and whales, the birds, whose eggs and meat were harvested from the cliffs, and the hardy sheep, which could survive on even degraded pastures. Ingólfur's decision to settle in Reykjavik, wherever he truly made that decision, whether it was divine guidance via the high seat pillars or his own assessment of the location's advantages, proved sound in the long term. Reykjavik remained inhabited, and over the centuries grew from a single farmstead to a cluster of farms, and eventually, more than a millennium later, to Iceland's capital city. But in Ingólfur's time, it was simply one farm among many, distinguished only by being first. The courage required to undertake such a settlement is worth contemplating. Ingolfer left behind a known world, however troubled, for a completely unknown one. He sailed across dangerous seas with his family and followers, knowing that if the settlement failed, there was no easy return, no rescue. Survival depended entirely on their own knowledge, skill, and luck. The Norse were a seafaring people, accustomed to risk, but this was risk of a different order. Not the risk of a raid or a trading voyage, which might last weeks or months, but the risk of permanent exile, of staking everything on the hope that life could be sustained in a new land. And yet they succeeded, not perfectly. Many died, many settlements failed, many children perished in their first winters. Many ships were lost at sea. The sagas, for all their focus on heroes and great deeds, also contain quieter acknowledgments of these losses. A mention that a settler's children all died young. A note that a farm was abandoned. A record that a ship departed Norway and was never heard from again. But enough succeeded that Iceland became home to a thriving Norse society. By the time of Ingolfr's death, the island's population was likely several thousand. Within another generation or two, it would reach perhaps Sissers, ling or more, an astonishing number for such a harsh environment, and one that would not be significantly exceeded until the 1st century. These people developed a unique culture, one that preserved and elaborated the Old Norse traditions in isolation from the continental developments. Iceland became the repository of Norse mythology and saga literature, producing some of the greatest literary works of medieval Europe. And all of this traced back, in part, to the decision of one man to Tufnfor Einarsson and Contras, the Trefric to Porus. To the decision of one man, Ingolfr Arnarsson, to throw his high seat pillars into the sea and follow where they led. Let yourself imagine his final days, as an old man perhaps sitting in his hall in Reykjavik, surrounded by children and grandchildren, watching the smoke rise from the geothermal vents that had given the place its name. He had crossed an ocean, buried a sworn brother, killed in vengeance, built a farm from nothing, survived winters that tested every resource and reserve of strength. He had seen his children grow, had divided his land among them, had established a legacy. Was he content? Did he ever regret leaving Norway? Did he miss the milder climate, the forests, the denser population? We cannot know. What we know is that he endured, and that his endurance made possible a new society, a new branch of the Norse world, in one of the most remote and challenging places that humans have ever called home. Rest now in the knowledge that human determination, ingenuity, and adaptability can find a way to survive, even to flourish, in the most unlikely places. Let the story of Ingolfr and the settlement of Iceland settle over you like snow, quiet and encompassing, as we prepare to move forward into the next part of our journey. When archaeologists began seriously investigating Norse settlement sites in Iceland, Greenland, and the far northern regions of Scandinavia in the late Sergilth and early Ursurth centuries, they encountered a puzzle. The physical remains they uncovered, the collapsed turf walls, the scattered artifacts, the middens filled with bones and broken pottery, told a story that seemed almost impossibly difficult. How had these people not simply frozen to death? The question becomes even more pressing when we examine sites from the Norse Greenland settlements established by Icelanders in the late 3rd century under Eric the Red. Greenland, despite its deceptive name, is far harsher than Iceland. The Norse settled on the southwestern coast, in two main areas known as the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, where narrow fjords provided some shelter, and where summer grazing was possible. But winters in Norse Greenland were brutal, long, dark, and intensely cold, with temperatures regularly plunging well below 0 Fahrenheit. These Greenland settlements thrived for roughly 4 centuries, from around Jubitbashtuwar AD until their mysterious disappearance in the Sturwarth century. At their peak, they may have housed Sunling II Wuling people, and then sometime in the Ichen Caesabides they vanished, When later European explorers visited the settlement sites, they found abandoned farms, empty buildings, and no trace of the inhabitants. What happened to them remains one of the great mysteries of Arctic archaeology, and understanding how they survived for as long as they did requires us to piece together evidence from multiple sources. Archaeological excavations, written records from Iceland and Norway, climate data from ice cores, and comparative studies of other Arctic peoples. And let us begin with the physical evidence, the buildings themselves. When archaeologists excavate Norse settlement sites in the far north, whether in Iceland, Greenland, or northern Norway, they find structures that share common features, refined over generations to maximize warmth and minimize fuel consumption. The foundation of a Norse Arctic dwelling was typically stone, local stone, gathered from the landscape and laid without mortar with astonishing precision. Upon this stone foundation, walls were built using turf blocks. These blocks were cut from the earth using specialized tools, essentially a sharp spade that could slice through the dense root mat that bound the soil together. Each block was heavy, perhaps 40 to 60 pounds, and cutting them was back-breaking labor, typically undertaken in summer when the ground was softer. The turf walls of a well-constructed longhouse could be 6 feet thick or more at the base, tapering slightly as they rose. This massive thickness served. First, it provided insulation. Earth and plant roots are poor conductors of heat, meaning that once the interior of the house was warmed, that heat remained trapped inside. Second, it provided thermal mass. The thick walls would absorb heat during the day from the interior fires and from any sun that might warm the exterior, then slowly release that heat overnight, helping to moderate temperature swings. Third, it provided structural strength to resist the powerful winds that could batter these settlements. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated construction details. Many buildings had multiple wall layers, an inner wall, an air gap, and an outer wall. This created a dead air space that further improved insulation. Much like modern double-glazed windows, excavations at sites like Brattahlid in Greenland, believed to be Eric the Red's own farm, show remarkably well-engineered structures with stone foundations that directed water away from the building, preventing moisture from seeping into the turf walls and causing rot or creating damp conditions inside. The roofs were equally. Excavated remains show that roofs typically consisted of wooden rafters, precious timber that had to be either brought from Scandinavia or salvaged from driftwood, covered with birch bark or sod as a waterproof layer, and then topped with thick turf. A well-made turf roof could be 2 feet thick or more. The vegetation would continue growing on the roof, creating a living layer that added to the insulation and helped stabilize the structure. In summer, wildflowers might bloom on the roof. In winter, the snow that accumulated added yet another layer of insulation. One of the most intriguing archaeological discoveries relates to the doors and entryways. Many sites, archaeologists have found evidence of elaborate entrance passages. Not a simple door opening directly into the main hall, but a series of connected chambers or corridors. At the farm complex of Gordon under Sandet, the farm beneath the sand in Greenland, which was preserved in remarkable condition by sand and permafrost after its abandonment, archaeologists found an entrance system that zigzagged, creating multiple barriers between the outside air and the interior living space. This design prevented wind from blowing directly into the house. When the door was opened, each angle turn created a buffer zone. These passages also served as storage areas for tools, outdoor clothing, and other items that needed to be accessible but didn't need to be kept in the warm interior. Some entrance passages had small side chambers where you could remove your outer layers before entering the main hall, preventing snow and moisture from being tracked inside. The doors themselves were made to seal tightly. Archaeological evidence shows the use of wooden doors hung on iron hinges, iron being valuable, and carefully worked, and fitted with leather seals around the edges to prevent drafts. Some sites show evidence of double doors, creating an airlock effect. When preserved wood has been found and analyzed, it shows careful joinery, with boards fitted together precisely to minimize gaps. Inside these buildings, archaeologists have uncovered the physical evidence of daily life. The central hearth is almost always present, a long stone-lined pit running down the middle of the structure. Analysis of the ash and charcoal in these hearths tells us about fuel sources. In Iceland, the ash contains peat residue and birch charcoal, along with traces of driftwood. In Greenland, where even scrubby birch was absent, the ash shows heavy use of willow, which grew in stunted form, heather and driftwood, supplemented by seal and whale blubber. Stone and ceramic lamps have been found at many sites, small vessels designed to burn seal or whale oil. These lamps, called blubber lamps, were crucial technology. They provided light in the long darkness and supplemental heat, though their primary fuel had to be carefully managed. The oil would be rendered from seal or whale fat, stored in skin bags or barrels, and used sparingly. The lamps were often carved from soapstone, which could be heated without cracking and which retained heat well. The sleeping platforms built against the walls show evidence of sophistication. At sites where preservation is good, archaeologists have found that these platforms weren't simply wooden shelves. They were often constructed with a slight angle, sloping down toward the wall, which helped keep sleepers from rolling off. Some had low dividers, creating semi-private sleeping alcoves for different family members. The platforms were typically raised about 2 feet off the ground, high enough that cold air, which sinks, would pool below the level where people slept, but not so high as to lose the benefit of rising heat from the fire. Middens, ancient trash heaps, provide some of the most valuable archaeological evidence. At Norse Arctic sites, middens contain bones, shells, broken pottery, worn-out tools, food waste, and other discarded material. Analysis of these bones tells us precisely what people ate. At Greenland sites, seal bones are overwhelmingly dominant, sometimes constituting Luxursbafended fu bashers of all animal bones found. This tells us that seals were the primary protein source. But there are also bones of caribou, Arctic hare, birds including geese and seabirds, and fish. Interestingly, there are very few fish bones at early Greenland Norse sites, despite fish being abundant in the surrounding waters. Puzzled archaeologists for years. The Norse were excellent fishermen in Iceland and Norway. Why would they not fish in Greenland? The current theory is cultural conservatism. The Greenland Norse apparently relied heavily on seal hunting, a technique they mastered, and didn't adapt to fishing as much as they could have. This inflexibility may have contributed to their eventual demise when seal populations fluctuated or when hunting became more difficult. Can the pottery sherds found in middens and excavation layers also tell stories? Chemical analysis of residues inside pots reveals what was cooked. Milk products, meat stews, fish, and sometimes grains. The wear patterns on pottery, on grinding stones, and on cooking vessels can reveal cooking techniques and food preparation methods. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries came from the analysis of human remains. Skeletal remains from Norse Greenland burials, particularly from the later period of settlement, show evidence of malnutrition and stress. Bones show growth interruption lines, Harris lines, indicating periods during childhood when growth temporarily stopped, likely due to severe malnutrition or illness. Teeth show enamel hypoplasia, another indicator of nutritional stress. Stature decreased over the generations, with later Greenlanders being noticeably shorter than their ancestors, suggesting chronic food shortage. These findings paint a picture of a population under increasing stress, particularly in the final centuries before the settlements were abandoned. But they also raise the question, why did the Norse persist in Greenland for 4 centuries if conditions were so harsh? And what finally caused them to leave or die out? The mystery of the Greenland Norse disappearance has generated numerous theories. Climate change is a leading candidate. The medieval warm period, which had made Norse settlement in Greenland more viable, began giving way to cooler temperatures in the Circanth and Circith centuries. A Little Ice Age, a period of notably cooler temperatures, was beginning. Ice core data from Greenland glaciers shows a clear cooling trend. This would have shortened the already brief growing season, reduced the availability of grazing land, and made sea ice more prevalent and persistent, interfering with seal hunting and communication with Iceland and Norway. But climate alone may not explain the disappearance. The indigenous Inuit people not only survived the same climate change, but actually expanded their range during this period, moving into areas the Norse had occupied. This suggests that cultural factors, the ability and willingness to adapt, were crucial. The Inuit hunted seal through the ice in winter, using breathing hole hunting techniques. They used kayaks and umiaks, larger skin boats, for water travel and hunting. They wore tailored clothing made from animal skins, which provided better insulation than woven wool. They had sophisticated knowledge of ice conditions, animal behavior, and survival techniques, developed over thousands of years in the Arctic. The Norse, by contrast, seem to have clung to European cultural practices, even when these were maladaptive. They continued to raise cattle, which required enormous amounts of fodder and provided relatively poor return in such a harsh environment. They built European-style churches. At least 16 have been found in the Greenland settlements, and maintained contact with the Catholic Church in Rome, paying tithes in walrus ivory. They apparently considered themselves European Christians, temporarily living in a remote colony, rather than Arctic people who needed to fully adapt to Arctic conditions. There's evidence from Middens that they did not adopt Inuit technology or food sources to any significant degree. Very few artifacts of Inuit manufacture have been found at Norse sites. There's no evidence that the Norse learned to hunt seals through ice, the way the Inuit did. They appear to have maintained significant cultural boundaries between themselves and the Inuit, limiting the exchange of crucial survival knowledge. The final abandonment remains mysterious because there are no written records of it. The last written record we have from Norse Greenland is a marriage document from Ichensibeitling recorded in the church at Valsey. After that, silence. When Danish-Norwegian expeditions reached the settlement areas in the 7th century, they found ruins, but no people, no bodies, and very few portable valuables. Some theories suggest the remaining population simply left, sailing back to Iceland or Norway when it became clear the settlements were no longer viable. Others suggest a slower decline, farms abandoned one by one, populations consolidating, and eventually falling below a sustainable level. Disease could have played a role. Raids by Inuit, though there's limited evidence for this. Starvation seems likely for at least some of the population. And what we can say with certainty is that the Norse Arctic settlements, both in Greenland and in the northernmost parts of Norway and Iceland, represented humanity pushing against environmental limits. For centuries, they succeeded through a combination of technology, social organization, and sheer endurance. The turf houses, the food preservation techniques, the careful management of livestock, the exploitation of marine resources, all of these work together to make life possible. But the Arctic is unforgiving of mistakes and inflexibility. When climate changed, when resources became scarcer, when the supply lines from Europe weakened, the settlements that could not or would not adapt faced extinction. The Greenland Norse seem to have fallen into this category. They survived for an impressive span of time, but ultimately, their European cultural identity may have prevented the adaptations that would have ensured long-term survival. Archaeological work continues at Norse sites across the North Atlantic. New techniques, isotope analysis of bones and teeth, ancient DNA extraction, improved dating methods, climate reconstruction from ice cores and lake sediments, continue to refine our understanding. Each excavation season adds new details to the picture. Kengt, at the site of Eiriksstaðir in Iceland, believed to be the farm of Eric the Red before he left for Greenland, archaeologists have reconstructed a longhouse based on the excavated remains. Walking into this reconstruction, even in summer, gives a visceral sense of what life was like. The thickness of the walls, the dimness of the interior lit only by a small fire, the low ceiling, the smell of earth and smoke. It transforms historical knowledge into physical experience. Similar reconstructions exist at Brattahlid in Greenland. and at various sites in Norway. These reconstructions, while necessarily involving some guesswork where evidence is ambiguous, provide invaluable insights. When you spend time in a reconstructed turf house, you understand in a way that no amount of reading can convey why entrance passages were angled, why sleeping platforms were positioned just so, why the hearth was placed where it was. You also understand the claustrophobia that must have been part of winter life. The interiors are dark, even with lamps and firelight. The ceilings are low. You can't stand fully upright in many reconstructions unless you're standing right in the center. The air would have been thick with smoke, since there were no chimneys in the modern sense, just gaps in the roof where smoke could escape. Your eyes would have stung, your lungs would have been constantly exposed to smoke particulates. Modern health studies of populations that live with indoor open fires show high rates of respiratory disease, and there's no reason to think the Norse were exempt from this. And yet they endured. Generation after generation, children were born in these turf houses, grew up learning the skills necessary for survival, and in turn had children of their own. The archaeological record shows us their material culture. Their combs carved from bone, their gaming pieces, their jewelry, their tools. These are not the possessions of people barely surviving. They show craftsmanship, leisure time for games, attention to personal appearance. Even in Greenland, at the very edge of the habitable world, people made things that were not strictly necessary for survival, but that added beauty and enjoyment to life. The Norse Arctic settlements represent a remarkable chapter in human history, a testament to adaptability, but also a warning about the limits of cultural conservatism in the face of environmental change. They survived for centuries by developing sophisticated technologies and strategies, but they ultimately failed, at least in Greenland, when they could not or would not adapt further. And let these archaeological remnants speak to you now. Across the centuries, the collapsed walls, the ancient hearths, the scattered bones and middens, they are the physical evidence of human lives, human struggles, human ingenuity, and human limitations. Rest in the knowledge that these people lived, loved, worked, and died in pursuit of a life in one of Earth's harshest environments, and that for a time they succeeded. Not all Norse people experienced the Arctic winter in the same way. While the cold pressed equally upon rich and poor, chieftain and thrall, the resources available to combat that cold, the quality of shelter, the quantity and variety of food, the security against starvation, these varied enormously based on one's position in the social hierarchy. To understand the full picture of survival in the Viking Arctic settlements, we must examine how social structures shaped the experience of winter and how the harshness of the environment both reinforced and occasionally challenged those structures. Again, let us return to Iceland in the 3rd century, perhaps a generation or two after Ingólfur's initial settlement. By this time, the island has been fully claimed. The best land, the coastal areas with good harbors, reliable water sources, and adequate grazing, has been taken by the first settlers and their descendants. A social order has established itself, mirroring but also adapting the Norwegian system from which most settlers came. At the top of this hierarchy were the chieftains, called Goðir in Icelandic. These were men, and they were almost exclusively men, who combined religious, political, and judicial authority. A Goði, the singular form, was not quite a king, not quite a priest, not quite a judge, but something of all three. He maintained a temple or sacred site. He represented his followers at the Alþingi, the annual assembly where laws were made and disputes settled, and he was expected to provide leadership, protection, and advocacy for those who pledged themselves to him. A chieftain's farm in 3rd century Iceland was a substantial establishment. Imagine yourself now not as an ordinary farmer, but visiting such a place. Perhaps you are a traveling merchant, or a poet seeking patronage, or a farmer come to seek the chieftain's judgment in a dispute. You approach the farmstead on horseback, and from a distance you can see it is larger than ordinary farms. There are multiple buildings, Not just a single longhouse, but several structures arranged around a central area. The main hall is immediately evident as the largest building. This is not a 60-foot structure like the one we visited earlier, but perhaps 90 or even 100 feet in length, broader as well, with walls even thicker and more carefully constructed. The turf is cut with precision, the walls are perfectly vertical, and there are architectural refinements, carved wooden elements visible around the doorway, perhaps decorative stonework at the corners. You dismount and are greeted by servants, not thralls, but free people who work for the chieftain in exchange for protection, land use rights, or payment. Your horse is taken to be stabled and fed. You are escorted through the entrance passage, which here is not simply functional but shows signs of wealth. The walls might be lined with wood panels rather than bare turf, and there are iron hooks for hanging cloaks and weapons. The iron itself, a display of resources since every piece must be either imported or laboriously smelted from bog iron. Entering the main hall, the difference from an ordinary farmhouse becomes immediately apparent. The central hearth is longer, and the fire burning in it is substantial. Real wood, not just peat, and plenty of it. The smoke rises toward roof vents, but here there are more sophisticated smoke management features, adjustable louvers that can be opened or closed to control draft and smoke escape. The high seat area occupied by the chieftain and his wife is raised on a platform slightly elevated above the rest of the hall. The high seat pillars themselves are masterworks of carving, intricate geometric patterns, possibly representations of gods or legendary scenes, worked into the wood by skilled craftsmen. These pillars are not merely functional, they are symbols of authority, continuity, and connection to the divine. The chieftain himself, when he receives you, is dressed in a way that immediately communicates his status. His clothing is wool, like everyone's, but the quality is superior. Finely woven, perhaps dyed in expensive colors. Red, especially, was a valuable dye color, requiring imported materials or extensive processing of local lichens. His cloak might be trimmed with fur, bear fur perhaps, or Arctic fox, both rare and valuable. He wears silver arm rings, possibly a silver chain, maybe a silver decorated belt. This silver represents portable wealth, but also serves a social function. A chieftain might remove an arm ring and give it to a follower as a reward for loyal service or exceptional deed. This practice of ring giving is celebrated in the poetry of the period, and the term ring giver becomes synonymous with a generous, worthy lord. The food served in the chieftain's hall is abundant and varied. When a feast is held, and chieftains held feasts regularly, as this was how they maintained their following and demonstrated their wealth, the tables are laden with multiple kinds of meat. There might be beef, mutton, pork, horse meat, seal meat, whale meat if a whale has been beached or hunted, various birds, and multiple types of fish. There is bread made from finely ground barley flour, and perhaps even wheat flour if the chieftain has access to trade goods from further south. There is butter, multiple types of cheese, and skyr in abundance. The drink served is also superior. While ordinary farmers drink weak ale, the chieftain's hall serves stronger ale, and perhaps mead, honey wine made from precious imported honey, fermented and aged. Mead was associated with poetry, inspiration, and the gods themselves. To drink mead in a chieftain's hall was to participate in something sacred and special. The hall is well lit by multiple sources. The central fire provides primary light, but there are also numerous oil lamps, some carved from soapstone, others made from iron, burning seal, or whale oil. These lamps are positioned around the hall, creating pools of light where people can work on handcrafts, where poets can read or recite, where games can be played, and games are played. The chieftain's household has leisure time that poorer households lack. There are hennefatafel boards, a strategic board game similar to chess, beautifully carved, with playing pieces made from bone, walrus ivory, or even amber. Dice games are played, with carved bone dice and wagers of silver. Stories are told at length, sagas recited by professional or semi-professional poets who travel from hall to hall. There art supporting them. Okay. The sleeping arrangements in the chieftain's hall reflect the hierarchy. The chieftain and his wife occupy the high seat area, which converts to a sleeping space at night. Their sleeping platform is wider, more comfortable, covered with the finest furs and woolen blankets. They might even have down-filled cushions. The down collected from eider ducks. Their children sleep nearby, in positions of honor. Other family members, trusted advisors, and important guests occupy spaces along the walls in descending order of status. But notice, at the far end of the hall, beyond the partitions where the animals are kept, there is another group of people. These are the thralls, the enslaved members of the household. Their experience of winter is radically different from that of the chieftain. Even though they live under the same roof, the thralls sleep in the coldest parts of the longhouse, nearest the doors, furthest from the fire. Their sleeping platforms, if they have them at all, are simple wooden planks without the cushioning of thick furs. They might have a single woolen blanket to share between 2 or 3 people. They sleep in their working clothes, having no spare garments to change into. Their food is sufficient to maintain their ability to work, but it lacks variety and quality. They eat porridge made from coarse barley or oats. They eat dried fish, often the oldest and least desirable portions. They receive meat only rarely, perhaps the least valued cuts, the gristly or fatty parts that others don't want. They drink the weakest ale or simply water. In winter, when food is carefully rationed, thralls receive smaller portions than free members of the household. Their work never ceases. While free household members have seasonal variations in their work, harder labor in summer, lighter tasks in winter, thralls work year-round at the most difficult and unpleasant tasks. In winter, they are the ones who go out in the worst weather to fetch water from the stream or spring, breaking ice if necessary. They clean the animal quarters, dealing with manure and urine, carrying it out to be piled for later use as fertilizer. They tend the animals at all hours. If a cow calves in the middle of the night, a thrall will be roused to assist. They process the endless quantities of wool, washing, carding, spinning, work that is tedious and never-ending. Thralls also serve at table when the chieftain feasts. They bring food and drink, they clear away, they stand ready to fulfill any request. They see the abundance that they themselves will never taste. This must have been psychologically difficult, though we have no direct testimony from thralls themselves. They left no written records, and the sagas written by and for the free classes rarely give voice to enslaved perspectives. The legal status of thralls was stark. They were property, not persons under the law. A thrall could be bought, sold, traded, given as a gift, or inherited like any other possession. They could be beaten or killed by their owner with little legal consequence. Sexual access to female thralls was assumed by male owners. Children born to thrall women were themselves thralls, regardless of who their father was. This created a permanent underclass, though manumission. The freeing of thralls did occur, sometimes as a reward for long service, sometimes in a dying owner's will, sometimes purchased by the thrall if they could somehow accumulate property. The contrast between chieftain and thrall represents the extremes of the social spectrum, but there were many gradations in between. Most Icelandic settlers were neither wealthy chieftains nor enslaved thralls, but free farmers of varying degrees of prosperity. A middling farmer, let us call him warrior, owns his land, inherited from his father, who was among the earlier settlers. His farm is adequate but not large. He has perhaps 20 sheep, 3 or 4 cows, a few pigs, and some chickens. He has a wife, 4 children ranging from toddler to teenager, and an elderly mother who lives with them. He has no thralls, which means all labor is performed by family members. He is a Taminting Mathur, a follower of one of the local chieftains, pledging his political support in exchange for the chieftain's protection and advocacy. Trónarír's longhouse is smaller and simpler than the chieftain's, perhaps 50 feet long, with turf walls that are thick but show some weathering and need periodic repair. His household works hard throughout the year. In summer, everyone who is able participates in haymaking, the crucial task of cutting and drying grass to feed the animals through winter. The amount of hay they can produce and store directly determines how many animals can be kept alive, which in turn determines the household's prosperity. Winter in warrior's household is a time of careful management. The family is comfortable but not luxurious. They have enough food most years, but there is no abundance. Meals are simple and repetitive. Porridge in the morning, dried fish and flatbread for the midday meal, a stew in the evening. Meat is eaten sparingly, reserved for feast days or when an animal must be slaughtered because it's failing and won't survive anyway. Keka. The work in winter is constant but different from summer's urgency. A warrior spends time repairing tools, making new ones, caring for the animals. His wife and mother work at textile production. This is their primary productive activity in winter. The wool from their 20 sheep, processed entirely by hand, can produce enough cloth for the family's needs and some surplus for trade. Good woolen cloth is a form of currency in Iceland. It can be traded for other goods. The rest used to pay fines or debts, or even used to pay the snissing farakop, the assembly tax required of all free men. The children learn by doing. The teenage son works alongside his father, learning farming, animal husbandry, tool making, and all the skills he'll need to eventually run his own farm. The daughters work with their mother and grandmother, learning spinning, weaving, sewing, food preparation, dairy work, and household management. The younger children help with simpler tasks and play their laughter. A bright sound in the dark hall. Knorrier's family is not wealthy, but they are free and independent. They owe no labor service to a lord. Unlike their counterparts in feudal Europe, they cannot be evicted from their land as long as they can work it and haven't committed crimes requiring outlawry. Warrior has a voice, however small, in the governance of Iceland through his participation in the sinting system. His status, while modest, is secure and respected, but there are farmers poorer than Eorir. Some own no land, working instead as tenant farmers on land owned by chieftains or wealthier farmers. They pay rent in labor, in a share of their production, or in both. Their security is less certain. A bad harvest, a harsh winter that kills their animals, an injury that prevents work. Any of these could lead to debt, to loss of their tenancy, and potentially to destitution. At the bottom of the free population were the landless laborers, people who owned no land and no significant livestock, who survived by hiring themselves out for seasonal work, by taking on whatever tasks others would pay for. Their winter survival depended on finding a household willing to take them in, providing shelter and food in exchange for work. Their position was precarious, only marginally better than that of thralls, though legally they remained free persons with rights under the law. The wealthy, meanwhile, experienced winter very differently. A truly prosperous farmer or chieftain might have multiple farms, managed by overseers, producing surplus that could be stored, traded, or used to support a large household including servants, craftspeople, and fighting men. Such a person could afford to import luxuries even in winter. Fine cloth from England or Frisia, silver jewelry, weapons made by specialized smiths, spices and delicacies. These wealthy households were centers of activity and culture. Poets, traveling craftspeople, merchants, and petitioners would arrive seeking patronage, trade, or justice. Winter, when travel was most difficult, might actually be when such people stayed longest, taking shelter in a chieftain's hall for weeks or months, contributing to the household with their skills, or simply with their conversation and news from other parts of the country. The chieftain's hall functioned almost as a small court. Disputes might be informally mediated there, alliances negotiated, marriages arranged. A chieftain with political ambitions would use the winter months to strengthen relationships, to host important visitors, to plan strategies for the upcoming christening season, when political matters would be formally decided. Women's status in this society deserves particular attention. Norse women, including in Iceland, had considerably more legal rights than their counterparts in much of medieval Europe. A woman could own property, inherit land, divorce her husband under certain circumstances, and manage household affairs with significant autonomy. A chieftain's wife was not merely a consort, but a partner in managing a complex household and political relationships. And during winter, when the household was confined together, the lady of the house held considerable power. She controlled the keys to the storerooms, literally wearing them on her belt as a symbol of her authority. She determined how food was distributed, managed the female servants and thralls, organized the textile work, and often managed the household economy. A capable wife was essential to a chieftain's success, and the sagas occasionally preserve stories of women whose intelligence and political acumen were crucial to their family's fortunes. But even among women there were hierarchies. A chieftain's wife had authority and comfort. A poor farmer's wife had freedom but relentless labor. A female thrall had neither freedom nor security, vulnerable to exploitation and with no legal recourse. The festival cycle helped mark the passage of winter and provided psychological relief from the darkness and confinement. Yule, the midwinter festival, was the most important celebration. For the wealthy, this meant massive feasting, gift-giving, and religious ceremonies. Sacrifices might be made to the gods, animals slaughtered with proper ritual, their blood sprinkled on altars, and participants, their meat shared in a sacred feast. These sacrifices served both religious and practical purposes. The gods were honored and the community was fed. For ordinary farmers, Yule was more modest but still important. A household might slaughter an animal they'd been saving, producing fresh meat for the first time in weeks. Special bread might be baked, weak ale might be strengthened, or mead produced if honey could be obtained. Families would gather, tell stories, and mark the turning point of winter. Yule occurred at the darkest time, but it also represented the promise of returning light, the gradual lengthening of days that would eventually bring spring. Even thralls benefited somewhat from Yule. The general atmosphere of celebration and the religious significance of the time often meant that thralls received better food during the festival, and their work was somewhat lightened. It was temporary, but it was something. As winter progressed into late January, February, and March, the challenges often intensified. This was when food stores were most depleted, when animals were at their weakest, when the cold still gripped the land but supplies were running lowest. The Icelandic language has a specific term for this period, slaughtermanúðar, roughly slaughter month, when animals that could not be sustained through the rest of winter were killed, their meat preserved or consumed immediately. And for the poor, this late winter period could be desperate. Stories preserved in the sagas occasionally reference families running out of food, reduced to eating lichen scraped from rocks, seaweed gathered from beaches, or slaughtering their breeding animals in violation of all good sense, simply to avoid immediate starvation. Sometimes these families survived until spring, sometimes they did not. The chieftains and wealthy farmers, with their larger stores and greater resources, might provide some support to their followers in the worst times. But this charity was neither universal nor unlimited. Spring, when it finally arrived, came slowly to Iceland, and even more slowly to Greenland and the far northern regions. The first signs might be subtle. The days noticeably lengthening, the quality of light changing, the snow beginning to consolidate, even if not yet melting. For all levels of society, spring meant renewed hope, but also renewed labor. Fields had to be prepared, animals driven to pasture as soon as vegetation appeared, fishing intensified, and the whole cycle of production begun again. The contrast between winter survival among the wealthy and the poor, the free and the enslaved, reminds us that while the cold affected everyone, the resources to combat it were unequally distributed. A chieftain in his well-built hall, warm by a substantial fire, well-fed and surrounded by dependents who ensured his comfort, experienced the same Arctic winter very differently from a thrall sleeping by a drafty door, hungry, cold, and working endlessly for another's benefit. And yet both inhabited the same harsh environment. Both depended on the same fundamental technologies and strategies: turf houses, preserved foods, wool clothing, and careful resource management. The Arctic winter imposed certain equalities even as social structures imposed inequalities. A collapsed roof, a failed food supply, a particularly brutal storm, These could threaten even the wealthy, and sometimes the most skillful and knowledgeable people in a household about practical survival matters might be thralls or poor laborers whose constant exposure to hardship had taught them hard-won lessons. Let yourself now imagine the full spectrum of winter experience, from the bright, warm chieftain's hall to the cold sleeping space of the thrall, from the abundance of the feast table to the sparse porridge bowl, from the security of the landowner to the precariousness of the landless. All of these people, with their radically different experiences, survived the same winter darkness, the same cold, the same isolation. Together, they formed a society that, for all its hierarchies and injustices, managed to persist in one of the most challenging environments humans have ever inhabited. And rest now in this knowledge, in the understanding that human societies are always complex, layered, and unequal, but that within them individuals find ways to endure, to create meaning, to continue. The winter night is long, but even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn. And so we come to the end of our journey through the long Arctic winter, through the lives of those who made their homes in places where darkness reigned for months and cold was the constant companion of every moment. We have walked through turf-walled longhouses, felt the warmth of peat fires, tasted dried fish and skyr, listened to stories told in the flickering lamplight, and witnessed the full spectrum of human experience in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The question we began with, how did Viking villages not freeze in Arctic winters, has revealed itself to be not a simple matter of a single technique or technology, but rather a complex tapestry of adaptations, knowledge, social organization, and human resilience. They survived through architecture that worked with the environment rather than against it. That's through thick turf walls that turned the earth itself into insulation, through careful positioning of sleeping platforms and ingenious entrance passages that kept the precious warmth inside. So they survived through meticulous preparation, through the labor of summer, months spent cutting hay, preserving fish, collecting peat, and gathering every resource that winter would demand. They survived through sophisticated food preservation techniques, drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, that transformed the abundance of brief summer into sustenance for the long, dark months. They survived through their animals, bringing cattle and sheep into their homes, sharing warmth in a partnership of mutual survival. They survived through wool, that remarkable fiber that could trap air and body heat, that could be woven into cloth and shaped into clothing that protected against wind and cold. They survived through social bonds, through the extended family sharing labor and resources, through the community that gathered in the longhouse, through the stories that passed the time and transmitted knowledge from generation to generation. Even the hierarchies, unfair and harsh as they were, served a function, concentrating resources and decision-making in ways that, however imperfectly, helped communities navigate the razor's edge between survival and catastrophe. But we have also seen the limits of survival. We have seen the evidence from Greenland, where the Norse settlements ultimately failed, where the last inhabitants vanished into mystery sometime in the Seabites, leaving behind only ruins and questions. We have seen that survival in the Arctic required not just courage and endurance, but also adaptability, a willingness to learn from the environment and from others who had mastered it. The contrast between the Norse failure in Greenland and the Inuit success in the same environment reminds us that cultural flexibility can be as important as any technology. The Norse brought with them sophisticated European culture, Christian religion, literary traditions, and advanced farming techniques. Yet in the end, their attachment to European identity, their reluctance to fully adapt to Arctic realities, may have sealed their fate. The Inuit, with different technologies and different cultural approaches, thrived where the Norse could not. What can we take from these long ago lives? As we lie here in our modern comfort, in our heated homes, insulated from cold by technologies that would seem like magic to a 3rd century Icelander, perhaps it is simply this, that human beings are capable of remarkable adaptation, that we can find ways to live in the most unlikely places, that we are resilient and ingenious and determined. But perhaps we can also take away a recognition of how much we depend on our accumulated knowledge, on the lessons learned by countless generations before us, on the technologies and techniques that were developed through trial and error, through success and failure, through the lives and deaths of people whose names we will never know. Like the farmers and fishermen of Norse Iceland, the chieftains in their halls, the thralls working in the cold corners, Ingolfur Arnarsson throwing his high-seat pillars into the sea. And following where they led, all of these people were solving problems, adapting to challenges, learning how to survive. Some of their solutions worked brilliantly. Others proved inadequate. But the fact that they tried, that they persisted, that they built lives and families and cultures in such harsh conditions, speaks to something fundamental in human nature. We are a species that explores, that pushes boundaries, that asks, what if we tried to live there? We are drawn to challenges, to the edge of the possible. Sometimes this leads to triumph, to the successful settlement of Iceland that persists to this day, with descendants of those original settlers still farming lands their ancestors claimed more than 1,000 years ago. Sometimes it leads to tragedy, to the empty farms of Greenland, to settlements abandoned and forgotten. But even in failure, there is something worth honoring. The Greenland Norse lasted 4 centuries in an environment that tested every resource they had. 400 years of births and deaths, of marriages and children, of daily labor and seasonal festivals, of stories told and songs sung. 400 years of human life lived fully despite the cold and darkness. That is not nothing. That is, in its own way, a kind of success. Okay? As you drift toward sleep now, let yourself feel gratitude for the warmth that surrounds you, for the light you can summon with the flip of a switch, for the food in your refrigerator that requires no months of desperate preparation to obtain. These are gifts, bought with the accumulated knowledge of millennia, with the work of countless people solving countless problems, but also carry with you some small ember of the spirit that drove those Norse settlers northward into the unknown. Of curiosity, of resilience, of willingness to endure hardship in pursuit of a goal, whether that goal was freedom from an oppressive king, new land to farm, adventure, or simply the next sunrise after a long polar night. The darkness they endured always ended. Spring always returned even when the winter seemed endless. The ice melted, the grass grew green again, the birds returned, and life renewed itself. This pattern repeated year after year, generation after generation, reliable as the turning of the earth itself. And so too will your darkness end. Whatever darkness you may be facing, the night is long, but it is not infinite. Rest now in the knowledge that humans have endured far colder, far darker nights than yours, and have emerged into spring. Rest in the warmth of your bed, in the safety of your shelter, in the comfort of the present moment. The Vikings' villages did not freeze because the people within them refused to surrender to the cold. They learned its patterns, respected its power, and found ways to create pockets of warmth and life, even in the deepest winter. You too carry that capacity to endure, to adapt, to find warmth in the darkest times. Sleep now, as those ancient people slept, wrapped in furs and wool, trusting that the walls would hold, that the fire would last the night, that morning, however distant, would eventually come. Sleep with the knowledge that you are part of a long human story, a story of survival and adaptation, of communities supporting one another through harsh times, of the quiet daily courage it takes simply to continue when conditions are difficult. Can spawn focus. Let the rhythm of their lives carry you into your own rest. Let the weight of their centuries of accumulated wisdom settle over you like a warm blanket. Perking. Let the darkness they knew and navigated cradle you gently into sleep. Okay? The long winter night is here, but so are you, safe and warm, connected across time to all those who have faced the cold and found ways to survive. Rest now, the spring will come, it always does. Good night.